mate. Look forward to it. I think I'll start with some Paul
Partisan struggle
Gottfried.
against the decadent Catholic Empire. And that's where the exceptionalness of the country comes in. Because, it has brought this Northern European Protestant civilization to North America. It has preserved it here, together with, Canada. And then, of course, you get sort of the British imperial view that this is all part of one great British a civilization. The American Revolution was some kind of mistake or something like that. But we're all British and we're all Protestant and so forth. Once you can't push that particular narrative any longer because the country becomes diverse, the question was, what else is going to determine the exceptional nature of the United States? And I think we're at a point where both sides, the so-called conservatives and the so-called liberals, conservatives are not really conservatives, they're just really not liberals, but whatever we want to call them, left and right, situational left and right, they both say America is diverse, America is full of all these different pluralistic, we all believe in equality or whatever, but we have to they interpret these things a little differently. So that for the conservative side, we are a propositional nation, but this was like established in the past. And even if you had, sexism, homophobia, racism, all these things in the past, the founding documents of the United States, the German or seminal documents, teach us equality, the Declaration of Independence. Then you have natural right in various state constitutions, and then the struggle against slavery. And Abraham Lincoln, saving us in the sacrament of blood, to use the words of Harry Jaffa. And we began our great march toward the civil right, toward expanding civil rights for blacks, bringing other people in. But this was all to be based on the proposition that was implicit in the American founding, but which took a while, almost in a kind of Hegelian fashion, to be realized in practice. Of course, now we're realizing it in practice. That's why we've become so good. Right now. Now, for the left, you have pluralism and equality, but they'd say that in practice, nothing ever conformed to this. And also, the left always has new demands. So it's not just race, it's gender, transgender, all this other stuff. But like no one on the face of the earth ever did all these things before, because nobody was ever as politically correct. So you cannot meet their standard of perfection. But they don't judge everybody equally, just Western countries. Other countries can enslave women, can kill blacks, anything they want, because they're victims of colonialism. But here we have to aim at a standard of political correctness that nobody ever achieved. And since we cannot meet this, it's almost like Luther's view of Protestant, of how can I win God's grace? Well, you're incapable of doing it. You're so sinful. Well, this is the left's view. The white race is damned. It's sinful. It's tainted. You must beg forgiveness from gays, transgendered, blacks, whatever. Now, for the right, we are already achieving it all, right? Because we're finally realizing the promise in the Declaration of Independence and the promise of the abolitionists and the promise supposedly of Lincoln, as they interpret Lincoln and so forth, and the struggle against fascism and Nazism. These are all good things. And of course, they see the Soviets, as the bad guys because they didn't believe in universal rights, or not the right sorts of universal rights. So for these people, the present moment is perfection. For the right, the present moment is the highest that we've ever achieved in realizing freedom and equality and pluralism.
Quite a few.
Okay, that's Paul Gottfried there. We'll go to an article in Tacky's Mag right now. Life Without Intellectual Principle by Christopher de Groot. Amid the decline of religion and traditional sources of value generally, question arises as to what people shall live for. Yeah. So I think for most of us, our fundamental problem is a lack of power. Right? We're content being stuck in dead-end jobs. We're content being stuck in dead-end relationships. We're content with mediocrity in our lives. We're content with overeating or using porn or however else we dead now by watching lots of Netflix or sports. We get our highs through ways that damage us. We feel compelled to participate in our own destruction. So where will we find a power greater than ourselves? Because notice, if you watch any movie, any TV show, read a novel, inevitably the main characters run into trouble because they have nothing greater than themselves and their own happiness. So when they pursue their happiness, that inevitably puts them at odds with other people because they're just pursuing their own desires for glory, for sexual or romantic satisfaction, for prestige, for money, for financial security. And as they pursue their own basic instincts, they inevitably run into conflict with other people. And living your life led around by your instincts doesn't really work for most people. So where do we find a power greater than ourselves? Judging by their reactions to events, the paltry answer for many on the left is sheer narcissism. From this perspective, the sacrosanct self, with its precious feelings, is now the arbiter of truth and of what is right or wrong for other people to do. So yeah, notice that when you watch TV, when you watch movies, when you read novels, notice that it's very rare that any of the major characters have anything to live for greater than their own satisfactions. Anything that's greater than their own idiosyncratic pursuits. And if they'd only had some transcendent principles, something to live for greater than themselves, some sort of transcendence in life, then they wouldn't run into these destructive cycles. For example, if you start having a lot of promiscuous sex, say particularly with married women, you can very well get killed for it. People will kill if you tread on them. And on the other hand, if you just at least have something in your life that's greater than yourself, something that's greater than your own satisfactions, then that will usually steer you away from the blind pursuit of the satisfaction of your own impulses. I've not yet seen Menashe on Netflix, half Galician, but I am back to Christopher de Groot. Hence, for example, the petty controversy concerning Janine Cummins' novel American Dirt. Cummins is a story of a mother and her son who flew to Mexico to pursue a better life in the US. The pursuit happens every day in real life, and this complex experience and the circumstances that give rise to it could be the stuff of fine fiction. Whether or not the book succeeds as fiction, the problem is that leftists insist on perceiving it in narcissistic political terms. True. Some leftist critics have argued that American Dirt is a literary failure. The scandal of the book, its unforgivable sin, is that its author is a white woman. See, in these days, to write about undocumented immigrants, you're supposed to be the right race. I do not know which race that is. Would it be wrong for a black person or an Asian person to write Cummins' novel? But given all the angry accusations of cultural appropriation, I see that it is not white. George Packer writes in an essay titled The Enemies of Writing, published in The Atlantic on January 23rd. A friend of mine once heard from a New York publisher that his manuscript was unacceptable as it went against a consensus on the subject of race. The idea that publishers exist exactly to shatter a consensus, to provoke new thoughts, to make readers uncomfortable and even unhappy. This idea seems to have gone dormant at the many houses where my friend's manuscript was running into trouble. Fortunately, one editor remembered why he'd gotten into publishing and summoned courage to sign the book, which found its way to many readers. But the prevailing winds are blowing cold in the opposite direction. Incidents like this, minor but chilling, happen regularly in institutions whose core purpose is to say things well and truly. Editorial assistant points out that a line in a draft article will probably detonate an explosion on social media. What is a supervisor going to do? Risk the blow up or kill the sentence? Probably the latter. The notion of keeping the sentence because of the risk, to defy the risk, to push the boundaries of free expression just a few meters further out, that notion now seems quaint, so the mob has the final edit. So I've got my pro extra heavy tension pro hands. So look at these. I think this is like the maximum, the heaviest ones that you can get. I think it's 13 pounds per finger. So very gainfully employed while I'm doing this live stream, working on my hand strength. Have that mighty grip when we shake hands one day. They're like, yeah, that feels good. Yeah, feel the pain, feel the burn. From Paul
Two
Godfrey
things I'd
and
like
Joseph
to
Carter.
say, but you don't have time to get through all of it. So why is it then that this is being rejected more and more by America's future? Definitely worth considering.
What I would say, is that the right and the left have similar narratives in the sense, or similar values: equality, pluralism. The conservative movement will always concede. I don't mean either one of us, as part of that movement, but sort of like looking at the media conservatives, they will always concede that America was racist, sexist, but all of these things are now being overcome because we're being true to our founding principles in a way that we were not as true in the past. Now, what the left will say is, yeah, we're all these things. We're racist, homophobic, all this other stuff, and we're really not much better than we were before. So we're going to have to work a lot harder to overcome all of this. But the conservative narrative about America being good and exceptional is based on the idea the founding principle, which was universal equality, is a good principle. It's the highest principle, according to West Coast Straussians and Jaffites, who are just all over the Trump administration and media conservatives. This is the highest principle, but we cannot. But according to the left, we have not yet achieved it. And it's sort of, as I said, it's sort of like Reformation Protestantism. No matter how you try, you fall short of the grace of God. You can never. Whereas, of course, all these other races and gays and this, they're all perfect. We just can't do it. Like white males or something. They're just stuck in sin or inequality and racism and sexism and so forth. But for the right, of course, the question is, why have they not succeeded? One of the problems, I would suggest, is the left's narrative makes much more sense. If you want to accept what I think are essentially leftist ideals, which the conservative movement has done, then the left is much better at pursuing them, right? And if you really want all this equality and all the other stuff, you're going to have to sort of work at it. And you're also going to have to, and if you say that, the conservatives say 600,000 people died in the Civil War, removing the stain of slavery. Of course, this is all nonsense, but I keep hearing 600,000 figure. Well, but the left would say that's just the beginning. It doesn't even, move you 1 inch toward grace. You have to do jump through a whole bunch of other, and then you have to beg forgiveness from all these groups you've offended and so forth. Whereas the conservatives believe you can achieve sort of cheaper grace. You can achieve grace by giving out some money to these minorities, saying, I feel guilty, and, but we've made it up for the past. And, you want me to take down a few more monuments, I'll do that for you too. But, the left, I think, is much more consistent in pursuing leftist ideals. They also promise more.
Yeah, can you believe that Paul Gottfried questioned the 600,000, sacred 600,000 figure? I mean, how dare he denigrate those who shed their blood to atone for the great sin of racism?
The kids want stuff. They give them stuff, right? I mean, I want college. I want you to give me money. They'll give you everything you want. So, the Republicans are tightwads. They're not going to give you free college where you can watch do video games for 4 years. You're going to have to pay for this. Democrats, they will pay for this for you. So, I mean, I think in terms...
The chat's calling Paul Gottfried a Civil War denier.
In terms of the material promise, that explains why more of the young people are lined up on the Democrat. But I also think the Democrats are more consistent. If you believe all these things, then, you're not really home free. You were a horrible racist, the Klan and this, and, women were treated as they weren't allowed to vote. They were second-class citizens. If you did all these, anyway, the gays were, not, gays had to hide, go into hiding. You did all these horrible things. And now we're trying to overcome them. But why do you think,
Okay, for my gay viewers, it's now time to come out of hiding. Don't live life in the shadows any longer. Back to Christopher de Groot. The leftists' intractable problem is that their idea of consensus derives not from anything objectively true or even reasoned, rather from sheer feelings, which are not the same among persons and groups. Fundamentally narcissistic, the left is committed to an impossible project, trying to stay within the acceptable bounds of opinion and expression, indeed letting the mob have the final edit. No such bounds, and the mob have no objective standard or criterion. What does this all mean for the right? For one thing, it is good news, for plainly the left is not a formidable enemy intellectually. The left prevails because it is ruthless, and if it is to win the culture war, the right must be willing to fight back. This includes having the intellectual principle so often lacks. At its worst, this lack of principle consists of yielding to leftist supremacies, essentially conceding to the left an unearned victory. Take, for instance, the right's touchiness about race. On February 2nd, Yoram Hazony tweeted, "The return of race science to respectability in some academic circles is supposed to show how open-minded they are. In fact, it's been a disaster for academia, fueling hatred for science and putting a weapon in the hands of the social justice censors. Just awful in every way." Well, the main news story for the past 3 weeks has been the coronavirus, and so far, everyone who's died of the coronavirus has been of the Chinese race. It seems a very significant racial difference, and yet it never gets mentioned by the news media. There's all this hysteria in the news media, and then all this anti-hysteria in the news media, but so far it appears that everybody who's died coronavirus has been Chinese race. Please correct me. So we're talking about maybe American citizens, British citizens, but they are of the Chinese race. They appear to be particularly susceptible to the coronavirus because there is some scientific evidence for distinctiveness regarding lung capacity and various things going on with the lungs and the breathing mechanisms of the Chinese that are a little bit different from other people, and has apparently made them much more susceptible to this coronavirus. Christopher de Groot tweeted in response to Yoram, "This needless yielding to the left assumes it is by no means evident that race science is not respectable or valid. However, insofar as people won't consider racial differences, inability, interests, etc., they will insist that unequal outcomes necessarily entail discrimination and try to use state power to correct these unequal outcomes." So yes, I'd be curious to see what evidence there is for non-Chinese dying of the coronavirus. On the other hand, we have all sorts of evidence of various Caucasians catching the coronavirus and curing themselves, just spending a few days in bed, and they get better on their own. So is the coronavirus disproportionately or even entirely just killing people of the Chinese race? That seems to be the overwhelming evidence right now. Or is it clear by Yoram Hazony's lights that research on sex differences shouldn't be off the table too? Anyway, the left also tells us that unequal outcomes between men and women necessarily an effect of discrimination is to be gained. Allowing the left to set the terms of the debate, the left seems to fear that moral worth might be determined by one's IQ, yet one needn't share that strange premise. For decades, Peter Brimlow of VDARE has argued to preserve what he calls the historic American nation. Peter Brimlow's position here is cultural and probabilistic, not essentialist or deterministic. Brimlow doesn't say anything so simple or as crude as this group is N, so therefore it will vote for such and such positions. Rather, he points to enduring group voting patterns over time. So since at least the 1950s, the Democratic Party has been the party of the coalition of the fringes against the white Christian core of the country. Brimlow points to enduring group patterns over time. Through those patterns, he concludes that if the United States wants to have responsible conservative policies, it should maintain a majority the people who will vote for such policies. People are free to disagree with this, but plainly there's nothing racist about it. Still, Peter Brimlow has long been ostracized by the right, since he does not fit the official right's consensus on race and politics. Brimlow was not welcome last summer's National Conservatism Conference organized by Yoram Hazony, Rusty Reno, editor of First Things, and other gatekeepers. According to Sohrab Ari, Brimlow's website VDare is utterly unacceptable and loathsome, opposing it is a matter of conscience. This is a perfect example of conservatism incorporated accepting leftist dogma. A person who thinks that America should maintain a coherent majority is not for that reason a racist or hostile to whites. It's as if the majority of people who I invite to a party are Catholics. It does not follow that I hate or hostile to Catholics.
You couldn't win grace so easily. You have to do a lot more. You have to beg a lot more for forgiveness from the groups you've offended. So I think in that respect, the left is much more consistent.
Looking at the numbers of American pride nowadays, the 18 through 29 demographic, this is of course according to Gallup, 24% of them are very proud to be an American. Between the age of 65, disproportionate.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I fit into that category, and I'm appalled by what the United States has become. I think it was much better in the 1950s when I was a kid. I like hardly anything. I mean, the technology is okay. I'll take the medical science at my age. I need it. But the culture, it sickens me. That's why I could not say I'm very proud of the United States. Unlike Laura Ingraham, I don't think we're living at the high point of American history, except maybe in terms of medical technology or communications or something like that. The people but some of the people who are not proud, who are over 65 or 70, probably live in.
Okay, Gandalf, anything you've heard you want to comment on before we start hitting your suggested stories from Friday?
Yeah, I really, really, really enjoyed. I enjoyed Paul Gottfried. He's actually one of the more underrated intellectuals in the United States. I think he understands a lot of the more subtle ideological and ethnic fault lines better than most people. I think it's kind of a shame that he isn't more well known. I think it would be interesting to combine Paul Gottfried's history of the New Left, because that's kind of like a major cornerstone of his work, with the kind of insights that, say, Jonathan Haidt has, mapping political ideologies onto Big Five personality traits. I think that would be a series of interesting discussions that would be worth preparing some material for. That's one of the things that I'm thinking about. He talks about the left being more consistent. The left is more consistent insofar as they have a very simple metric, and their major ideological axis. And it becomes incoherent eventually because it's not really a logical axis, it's an emotional axis, but it's about care versus harm. Progressives always want to be at least seen, hence the virtue signaling, as being on the side of caring. And obviously the boogeyman is, the evil white people or whatever, because everything in the left now seems to be about fighting, allegedly evil white people all over the place who are evil because I guess they don't hate themselves enough or aren't engaged enough ethno self-masochism. But yeah, that's what comes to my mind.
Okay, you sent me a long story here from Philadelphia. Bulletproof glass in small Philly stores debated at council. Supporters of a city council ban on bulletproof glass in businesses say they degrade communities. So this is amazing. A city councilwoman's bill to potentially ban bulletproof glass from stores that she says are skirting regulations we brought up Thursday. Stop-and-go business model which allows beer and liquor to be sold to adults alongside candy and soda for children with little or no food sales can no longer exist in Philadelphia, says City Councilwoman Cindy Bass. This is not about plexiglass. This is about what the community wants. People deserve businesses that serve food with dignity and respect. Well, I would think that any stores that have bulletproof glass in Philadelphia, they probably have very good reasons having bulletproof glass because of explosions of crime from certain population groups, which I can't name. But Gandalf, any thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, this has actually been a fight going on back and forth in the city council in Philadelphia, going on almost 3 years. I believe that this story is a little bit older. The reason I sent all this to you because of earlier discussions from the previous week, and looking at what's really going on in the Democratic Party, is the reality is that none of these other non-European tribes, they actually don't get along together that well. I mean, that's something which is coming in greater stark relief as the years go by. I mean, let's just call the melanated 1350s have in Philadelphia in particular. I mean, there's been a rash of gang violence against Asian students. I mean, there's a lot of racist behavior toward Asian students, and it's a big problem. I mean, lots of places. The 1350s aren't too good to other minority groups, yet they blame white people for it, which is just intellectually incoherent.
Okay, let me play a video here on bail reform
with
reality.
Our cash bail system. It's criminalizing poverty. In fact, the vast majority of people who are sitting in jail in our country are there on low-level crimes, on low-level offenses. Nothing that makes us worry about public safety.
Okay, that's the fairy tale. Here's the reality.
Nothing that makes us worry about public safety.
The Syracuse man facing robbery and grand larceny charges was let go by a judge in the Capital Region Tuesday because of the new bail laws.
An update on a deadly hit and run in Rockland County where the suspect was released because of the new bail reform law. 27-year-old Jorge Flores Villalba had been charged with a felony in the death of 35-year-old Marie Osai in Stony Point. But he was released without bail the day after the crash.
Had just been told their son was the first fatality linked to the new state bail reform law.
Of a bail reform law.
This man.
Nothing that makes us worry about public safety.
For interfering with his ignition interlock device, had 3 prior DWI convictions before he allegedly drove drunk again. This time the crash Sunday was fatal, claiming the life of the SUNY Buffalo graduate.
14 when he shot the officer. He was released in February after serving 10 years for that shooting. He was recently arrested again on drug charges in December. According to New York's criminal justice reforms law, these charges do not qualify for bail.
Nothing that makes us worry about public safety.
An accused peeping Tom has been arrested on Long Island, allegedly caught recording an unclothed woman through a bathroom window. And now neighbors are upset. A new law has him back on the streets already.
Him charged with 2 separate unprovoked attacks on women within hours of each other, including this 23-year-old too terrified to show her face. The attack so violent, it knocked out a tooth.
I got pushed from the side and then attacked again, and I was punched in the head.
But Webb might have been smiling today, because under the new criminal justice reform laws, he was released without bail, despite the fact that there was a warrant for his arrest for not showing up in court to face charges from a similar attack in September.
Low-level crimes on low-level offenses. Nothing that makes us worry about public safety.
How dare you continue to risk the brown and black bodies of people simply to cater to people who are afraid?
People are not going to live. These people are not going to live in these communities.
Stick with the merits of the bill, please.
All right. The sponsors of this bill do not live in those communities. There are innocent black mothers and children who are dying for help. They are overpopulated by criminals who are already in their community. I'm working with a woman right now. Her daughter was raped, a black single mother. Her daughter was raped. Her house has been robbed. The criminals are walking down the neighborhood, and they are afraid to report it to the police because they know that these criminals are going to come after them because they're in and out of jail already.
Money bail impacts the most our communities of color, black and brown people.
The reality.
I've come to the conclusion that media collusion is wrapped up in...
Okay, Gandalf, any comments?
Yeah, I mean, what's going on in New York is pretty terrible. I mean, even before bail reform, I remember I was on a train this summer, and two New York women who were in their 60s. One was a Jewish lady, the other one was an Irish lady, and they were asking for some directions around my city here. And I was asking, I used to live in New York. How are things? And they said they're both from the Upper East Side, somewhere around 85th Street. And they said, well, is the city doing better or worse under De Blasio? Uh, and they say they don't want to leave their house anymore. These two older women, like they say, it's too scary. Like there's stories of pickpockets and robberies and things like that from certain populations, and that hue of people, is kind of out of control right now. And that was before bail reform. I mean, I think one of the women who assaulted, I think, a Jewish person in Brooklyn was someone who'd been let go on bail like a couple weeks before. I mean, New York City has decided to abandon what worked under Giuliani and under Bloomberg, keep crime to a minimum, and it's going back the way it was in the 70s and 80s. And it's going to get really bad in another year or two. I mean, unfortunately, you can't really afford to be lax with people that would be predatory on other people.
Right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add something that from people who work in law enforcement, they tell me that they notice certain reactions in different population groups. So in one population group, when you arrest someone, generally in East Asian, they say, give me my punishment. I deserve my punishment. I did wrong. Other groups, they immediately lawyer up. Other groups just go, oh, you're racist. You're just taking advantage of me. You're just going after me because I'm a certain race. There are very distinctive reactions to being arrested and being charged from the different population groups. So I want to mention a story here from San Francisco. Chinese residents fear they are targeted by criminals, but the data tell a different story. Newly released numbers show black community bears the brunt of many crimes. So the Chinese, apparently in San Francisco, should stop complaining because they are not proportionally as often victims of crime as San Francisco's black community. Data revealed by San Francisco police this week show it's actually the black community disproportionately bears the brunt of aggravated assault and sexual assault. Put it simply, the percentage of crime victims made up of members of the Asian community is far less than the percentage of their population in the city. So apparently Asians in San Francisco should just shut up because they have a lower percentage of being victims of crime. Therefore, they should just shut up about it and just take it. Gandalf, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a big problem. Stefan Molyneux did his series about what was going wrong in the Golden State a couple months ago, and he had the conflicts between black and Asian communities over crime was something that was highlighted quite a bit, and the police department was, trying to rationalize to angry Asian constituents that we want to show compassion to criminals. You need to do more to defend yourself. And a lot of these Asian shopkeepers and homeowners were like, no, we want these criminals taken off the street and put in jail. And we're clearly being targeted, if perhaps racially. And so there's a lot of anger over that in San Francisco. And it's not only that particular group. I mean, you also have rising numbers of homeless people, aliens from south of the border. A lot of these people are also drug addicts or mentally ill. They're breaking into cars to try and find money to get their next fix, even though their drugs already are being provided to them for free at all of these kind of needle depots and whatnot. San Francisco is really, really starting to descend into chaos, and the group of people which seems to be bearing the brunt of it it's Asians. Now, there's a Colin Flaherty talks about it a lot, and I've seen it myself, is that there is a culture within a historic minority community here, of no stitches for snitches. So take the crime, don't be seen reporting it to authorities, otherwise you yourself might be targeted. And this kind of culture has existed for one, if not two generations, and it's got people into a kind of Stockholm syndrome even within that community who are targeted by their criminal element, so that it festers and festoons like a wound, and it's not being addressed or healed, and it's really quite tragic. I mean, I'm someone who's just absolutely intolerant of crime, chaos, violence. I don't want it around, and I don't know how we get people on the page of, like, someone who's going to bonk someone over the head to steal their purse or have fun with rape, robbery, or murder is someone you want around. I mean, I don't want those people around. I think it doesn't matter who you are. We shouldn't want those people in our society because it reduces social trust and harms a lot of innocent people.
Yeah, and the true cost of crime is not just the explicit victims. It's everybody whose quality of life is deteriorated by crime. So people who stay shut in, people who don't go out much, people who participate less socially, people who have to go through elaborate security precautions. Everybody's life is affected by crime. People who are much more reluctant to help other people in case they become victims of crime. There's this deteriorating cycle that just wrecks communities. And so victims of crime are not just those who are explicitly victims of crime, it's everybody whose quality of life is being affected. And so I've grown up in communities where there was virtually no crime, where people did not have to lock their doors, whether their car doors or their homes. That's how I grew up in Australia. That's how I grew up in the Napa Valley. And that's how I grew up in Auburn, which is north of Sacramento. There was virtually no crime, very different from Los Angeles, particularly today, where crime is exploding. Here's an article from the Daily Breeze in Southern California. Gang members suspected of 5,000 burglaries arrested in Torrance-led police raids. Torrance police arrested 13 reputed South Los Angeles gang members Friday in a massive pre-dawn operation to break up an organized ring believed responsible for some 5,000 residential burglaries in 5 Southern California counties. The operation, dubbed Operation Moneybags, culminated nearly 4 years of investigation to not just arrest and prosecute suspected burglars, but to tie their crimes to their gangs using gang-related sentencing laws that could add years to their prison terms. So California has decriminalized a lot of crimes, reduced them from felonies to misdemeanors. It used to be a felony to knowingly transmit HIV. Now you can steal goods up to $950 worth, and it's only a misdemeanor in California. So who exactly are these people carrying out these crimes? The East Coast Crips gang. It's a primarily black gang made up of various factions located in neighborhoods east of the 110 freeway in South Los Angeles. Gang leaders figured out that developing an organized burglary plan could be extremely lucrative. Each day, burglars had a goal of finding $5,000 and a gun, sometimes heading out to commit crimes 4 or 5 times a week. Each gang member targeted Friday was suspected of involvement in 125 to 150 crimes. Gang leaders planned the burglaries in meticulous fashion, picking out neighborhoods to target, dressing professionally, and using high-end rental cars in an attempt to not draw attention to themselves. So it used to be that you could have community watch. It used to be that neighbors would look out for each other, but now civil rights legislation is angry about that because not all groups commit crimes at an equal rate. And so therefore, if you have a community watch and you have people on the lookout for people who don't belong in a community, unlike the past where you had generally ethnically drawn communities, now you're not supposed to notice certain things that are associated with enormous rates of crime. Gandalf, any thoughts?
Yeah, this story was probably the biggest burglary ring in California in the last decade. And some members of this gang, this story I think came out 2 years ago, but it's indicative because there's other rings of unsolved burglaries that are all over California right now. This is just the biggest one that's been solved from this population, probably. I think some members of this gang were listening to a very popular rap song, I think by YZ, talking about why Asians need to be targeted, because Asians, usually whether from India or from the Far East, tended not to be as banked as other groups. So there'd be lots of jewelry or cash inside their homes. And this is sort of true. So following this rap song and this idea, they deliberately racially targeted these Asian groups, because in the areas in Torrance, which this gang did most of its damage, were areas which were heavily Asian. And they would, other stories I've read on this subject mean that they'd scout these homes for weeks in advance and then develop kind of maps, and they were pretty deliberate and thorough in making sure they hit all of their targets. And it's caused major problems between between Asians and kind of this heritage minority population, and it's really quite sad. I think you're going to see, as the decade progresses, I think it's not going to be good for this particular heritage population if they don't start respecting some of these other groups. I mean, I think from their perspective, though, to be fair, I mean, this heritage population, hasn't had a good relationship with the police. The police haven't exactly been good to them. And they kind of feel a little bit alienated in this country, despite being here for several centuries themselves. So it's a complicated deal to get all of these groups on the same page about, certain behaviors can't be tolerated and everyone needs to have their own space and autonomy respected. And I'm hoping we get to a point where, as a society, we can have mature conversations about that, because it's really in the best interest of everybody.
Okay, I want to play another video you sent me.
Tonight about a group of kids deemed the teen mob. A Chicago nail salon owner says they're taking things to a whole other level, pepper spraying employees before leaving without paying. CBS 2's Audrina Begas has the story in this original report.
In the Loop at Fashion Nails, there's always people coming and going.
They just ran out.
But not running.
20 years of career, I never have, something happen like that. It was shocking because they travel in groups and you just can't catch them.
She calls them the teen mob. On Wednesday, she says a group of 9 teens came in to get their nails done but ran out before paying.
If it happens, they run off. It's okay. But now they're taking it to another level.
2 guys with the group pulled out pepper spray.
They actually just started spraying. Yes.
Spraying 2 nail techs.
Weapon that attack us. That in a second it hurts, it burns.
Now they're warning others.
Read their body language. If they travel in groups, ask them to pay first.
Right now, you assaulted me. Get the fuck off me. Yes, you are. You're recording it, right? You're recording it, right? Thank you. Get the fuck off of me. Get off of me. No fucking respect. Get the fuck off of me, T. Hey, get the fuck off of me, T. I swear, get off of me. You're hurting me. Get off of me now. Now. Get off of me. See?
Come on. Just let her go. Come on.
Let go of me. Let go of me right now. Get off of me. Let go of me. Get off of me. Get off of me. Get assaulting me. Get off of me. Damn. Get off of me.
Come on.
He's assaulting me.
Nah, you assault her first.
No, I'm an officer. You gotta let me go. Yeah, you can't do that.
Go nowhere.
Let me go. You can't do that. Let me go. Off me. I mean, your own will. Come on. You got her information, don't you?
Oh, I know.
Oh my God. Hey girl!
Anything in here?
They is cutting up in here.
What the fuck you doing? Thank you. Keep passing my phone.
Where you at back there getting your I'm just waiting.
You assaulting me now.
They is cutting up.
Thank you for recording me. Thank you. Get the passing my hat. My hat. Thank you. And my shoes. Thank you. Yeah, you touched me. I got my nerves bad wrong. He attacked me, and he know what he did was wrong. You put your hands on me because a girl's in my fucking. I can say what the fuck I want to say to her. She don't need to jump in my fucking business, and you attack me, and you get your whole staff to jump me. One, you in the red. You three, you're going to jail. I'm pressing charges. I'm pressing charges. If I'm going to jail, you're going to jail. So you're going right with me. So you better stop doing them fucking nails.
Oh my God! Thank you, Jesus. Thank you. Oh
white girl
God!
Listen to you with the pink hair.
Come on,
You piece of.
Okay, Gandalf, any thoughts? Okay, oh, my mistake, my bad. Okay, Gandalf, start again. I had you muted. Start again, Gandalf.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's my fault.
Yeah, there was a nail salon on the south side of this city, where a patron, a heritage American patron, refused to pay, I think, a Korean, nail salon tech their fee, and she created a huge disturbance. Her boyfriend came in, made it get worse. They called the police, forced the heritage American couple out. They claimed racism on the Asians, tried to organize a boycott. Boycott failed, and then people tied to the original non-paying customer threw bricks and totally trashed the store. So there's kind of a history of problems, and it's not talked about a lot. A lot of our fellow Asian citizens are treated extremely poorly. They're seen as weak. They're seen as people that can be targeted. And, as long as you can claim, racism, I guess you can get away with anything. I think a lot of people aren't as aware of these fault lines that are developing. I think, there's this idea, though, because there's a subset of this heritage population that causes all these problems, that this entire population is, insolvable or unable to be helped out. I'm not so sure about that. There's a growing plurality in certain circles that just want this behavior stomped out, because I think they're starting to get a sense, and this is what you can kind of see now. This is kind of why, this particular voting block isn't seen as so important anymore. From the point of view of many of these major Democratic candidates, is the Asian and Latino populations, I think, are starting to no longer feel common cause anymore with this group. And I think this group is going to face its own reckoning with disenfranchisement in America, and they're not going to be able to blame white people for it, and they kind of know it on some level. So it's going to be interesting to see how this group changes its view of itself going forward. In certain circles, I'm cautiously optimistic. In other circles, I'm decidedly pessimistic on this point. But it's worth bearing out that, the whole POC meme doesn't make much sense. I mean, all of these other groups are quite different. Heck, Koreans, Vietnamese, Chinese people are very different, just like Germans and Poles and Irish and Russians are different. And the heritage American descendants of slaves are very different from, say, African groups that come over here. I mean, I lived, when I was growing up, with a lot of Nigerians. So, they're very different from this particular population. I mean, I think it's much more important to when you break down things along ethnic levels, to be extremely nuanced and compassionate and fair, and try and look at things with a lot of this granularity and nuance, which is often not brought out in the kind of left-wing discourse that Paul Gottfried was repeating earlier.
I'm looking at an article from Bloomberg Opinion here from January 10th. Rule number 1, if you're in a corporation, never email. If you must break rule number 1, rule number 2 is imagine you're writing a press release instead of email. Boeing Corporation is the latest example of the merciless logic of these rules. It has released a trove of emails in which employees discuss the development of the troubled 737 MAX in the most embarrassing terms imaginable. This airplane is designed by clowns who in turn are supervised by monkeys. I'll be shocked if the FAA passes this turd. Would you put your family on a MAX simulator trained aircraft? I wouldn't. One employee bragged they had Jedi mind tricked the fools at the FAA. So I thought diversity was our strength. It doesn't seem that way with Boeing. Let me go back to this Essay by Christopher de Groot, Tacky Mag. His much discussed essay against David Frenchism, published last May in First Things, Sohrab Ahmari presents himself as taking a friend-enemy approach to politics. He rightly criticizes David French, finding that his responses to the increasingly aggressive left are quite inadequate, and yet Sohrab Ahmari himself is akin to French. Indeed, he is himself the functional opposition that he sees in the conservative advocate of drag queen Story Hour. In typical leftist fashion, Sohrab Ahmari makes Peter Brimlow out to be a bad guy, when in reality, the older man was fighting the good fight in this country back when Ahmari, who's only 35, was still a boy. One would think that Ahmari might want Brimlow as an ally, but Ahmari takes the politically correct line on race, and as a result, his approach to politics as war and enmity is mere posturing. So I just want to make a point here. It's just brain dead to ignore race when addressing virtually every important social issue in the United States. If you want to talk about educational reform, you have to look at how it's going to affect different populations. If you're going to talk about trying to get more people to use public transport, then you have to address how it's going to affect different populations. So, for example, most respectable people are not going to want to take public transportation with people who are slovenly, with people who have high rates of crime, with people who are on welfare and irresponsible in the way they make their choices. So public transportation is not going to work very well, generally speaking. If you have, say, whites and Asians are not going to use it if there are a lot of lower class blacks and Latinos. So that, from public transportation to education policy to healthcare policy. So in the United States, whites and upper class Asians and Latinos are not going to vote for policies that will subsidize or give away free healthcare to groups that they regard as largely undeserving or exploitative, or just on the take and unwilling to take responsibility for their own actions. So we have different groups in this country. Some groups contribute a massive amount more in taxes than they take out in social welfare spending. And so these contributions basically break down on average IQ lines. So high IQ groups will contribute far more in taxes than they'll take out in social welfare spending. Average groups with average low IQs will take out far more in social welfare spending than they will contribute in taxes. So it's not uncommon in various jobs I've had where there'd be many generations of a family that was where the members either spent substantial amount of time in prison or all on welfare or on disability. And the number of high functioning, high tax paying individuals in the family were virtually nil. They had a job, it was some easy government job where they weren't expected to do much work. So therefore, if you have groups who are taking a great deal from society, who have astronomical rates of crime, astronomical rates of welfare usage, astronomical rates requiring imprisonment, compared to relatively low levels of contributing to the tax base, that's going to cause a great deal of tension with higher achieving groups who are paying the majority of the taxes and taking away proportionally quite small level of social welfare spending. So generally speaking, you can't expect out-groups to want to subsidize your in-group dysfunction, because by and large, groups don't care about out-groups. People inside one group don't care very much about members of another group, and they particularly don't want to subsidize them and subsidize their dysfunction. Gandalf, any thoughts?
Oh, that's all the social science data supports that. I mean, there could be a lot more data on that, but I mean, it's a political third rail for a lot of people. But you know, the two scholars do most look at, well, three. On the crime question, it's Edwin Rubenstein. On the social capital question, it's Robert Putnam. And on multiculturalism, it's Byron Roth. I mean, those three, you probably present the greatest amount of data on all these questions, and it's unmistakable that I'm kind of like a little more on the side of instinctively on social welfare, in the sense that, you know, I want everyone cared for, but the more I've gotten kind of red pilled, I sort of realized that you can't take, the high IQ male breadwinner tax-paying families and take money from them by force of state and force them to subsidize more dysfunctional or chaotic groups, because ultimately that'll boomerang on the smaller families of mostly whites and Asians and groups like that, because they'll be drowned in a sea of chaos. And I think we have to face that reality and not subsidize what we don't want. And I think if you had the right parallel action where you figured out how to get, I'd say, like a Jesse Lee Peterson types, or a lot of Nation of Islam types. I've worked with jobs with Nation of Islam people before, and get them kind of in a mode where they can discipline the youth earlier on, like provide some of the structure that a lot of these people don't have at home and probably will never find in a school. Get these very high testosterone youth channeling anger and aggression and energy toward things other than mayhem and crime. I think there's more hope than people think. People just have to face the problem and design solutions fitting that problem. And those solutions don't have to be inhumane. I mean, I think people have this mentality that, that group is hopeless and they need to be hated. Maybe they just are what they are, and we can optimize it for the best of themselves and everyone else and be intelligent about it. I think, that's the approach we should be taking.
Right. You don't want to be subsidizing dysfunction. So it's no accident that California's homelessness surge occurred once the state started spending billions to combat homelessness. By spending billions of dollars to essentially subsidize homelessness and encourage homelessness, you therefore got a massive increase in homelessness. And you also know that the more welfare you give, the more children people on welfare will have. So if you keep welfare payments restricted quite low, then people are much more reluctant to have children. When you make having children while on welfare increasingly easy, then people have more children. So we need to align our social welfare spending in a way that does not encourage dysfunction, but instead encourages pro-social behavior. Right now, much of our social welfare spending encourages antisocial behavior. This is very different from the situation in, say, Scandinavia, where you overwhelmingly have high social cohesion and highly functional individuals, by and large, of one extended family who feel like they're in it together. Let me play more here from Paul Gottfried.
Jerry Nadler's voting districts, or like Bernie Sanders or something. I mean, you do get these old radicals, who were traditional communists or something, and that now they've all gone over to intersectional nonsense and so forth. They like move from one. This is the only left. They only left us around now. So Sanders moves from one to the other. But they're not proud of America because they exploit people or something. So you do expect a certain percentage of older people not to be proud for leftist reasons. But I think you're right. There are Republicans or over 65 or 70, whatever it is, who are absolutely appalled by things going on in this country. And they don't buy the argument that we're living at the apogee of American history.
I think that the younger people on the cultural society, you're going to get more and more of this.
There is, in fact, a point at which left-wing identity politics and the traditional right join. For instance, if someone would say, the Declaration of Independence was written by, a planter who owned slaves in Virginia. Somebody like Mel Bradford, who was the great old right Southern historian, the student of the agrarians, would say, yes, that's true. And you have to understand the Declaration of Independence in terms of how it would have been understood by a Virginia planter who owned slaves. And probably found nothing in. Of course, Jefferson did say that slavery was bad, sort of intermittently. Although later on, he sort of reconciles himself very easily with the existence of slavery, and even develops racial arguments to defend it. But it is not irrelevant to say, to consider the social circumstances of the people who were writing the Declaration and were signing on to it, And there were many people who were very uncomfortable with the propositionalism, who did not believe that all men are created equal, or thought that, you shouldn't stick this stuff into a Declaration of Independence, but we're not going to get into this question. And this is very well treated by the historian Barry Shane, who wrote a large work on the Declaration of Independence, trying to show exactly the opposition to Jefferson's proposition. Barry is a close friend of mine. He has not made himself welcome in present conservative circles. So he's certainly on the right, but he's basically a scholar, and he says, and he raises the same question. He never mentions Mel Bradford, but he raises the same questions that, someone like Forrest McDonald did the same kind of stuff. You have to really ask yourself, what did they mean? Did they see a contradiction? If they did not see a contradiction, how might they have understood this? I mean, to me, it is not irrelevant that John Locke, from whom Jefferson cribbed the phrase, life, liberty, it was actually life, liberty, and property in Locke, also wrote the Constitution of the Carolinas, in which he included defense of slavery and gave the master absolute power over the slave. So did he consider the slave to be, it's obviously not part of the social contract. It was a slave born with natural right, or how did he understand? Did he try to reconcile the two? So, I don't think the question is irrelevant. Looking at it as an historian and a person whom I, is really neither in one camp nor the other camp in terms.
So I think it's very important to see everything in its context. I'm a historicist. So, for example, the things I say now on YouTube are quite different than what I said a year ago. Is it because my opinions have changed dramatically in the past year? No, it's because the context has changed. YouTube's terms of service have changed, and also wider society has changed. You've got all these spree killers citing alt-right rhetoric. So therefore, I have to disavow that and shift away from that because of circumstances way beyond me, because of spree killing in Christchurch and spree killing in El Paso, etc. And in addition, increasing censorship on social media. So that changes the way I speak. So if someone looked at me and the things I'm saying now as compared to a year ago or 2 years ago, on the face of it, my opinions, my way of looking at the world has dramatically changed. But that's not taking in the historical context. Like what are the circumstances in which I'm speaking now as opposed to a year ago, as opposed to a year or 2 years or 3 years before that, because the circumstances are frequently changing. So whenever we look at a document such as the Declaration of Independence of the United States Constitution, or we're looking at the book of Genesis or the book of Revelation or the works of Aristotle or Aquinas, first question we have to ask is, right, who wrote this particular piece of work? When was it written? And for whom was it written? So these are three basic questions of literary analysis that also are important questions for dealing with the reality all around us, even YouTube live streams. Gandalf, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm something of a historicist too, in the vein that you are. I think context dependence is extremely important. I mean, this is one reason why I push back so hard against the kind of inconsistency in the right that Paul Gottfried's alluding to. This more constitution, more individual rights, more free market, more spread democracy everywhere kind of stuff. It's like, is that really what the framers had in mind? I mean, I remember when I really started for a long time, and it drove me into a leftist ditch for about 10, 12 years, up until the bathroom issue kind of started to wake me up. The Iraq War, like these arguments that we need to spread democracy to Iraq. I mean, I remember George Washington's farewell speech, the last speech he gave before he left the White House. And he had said, we want to avoid entangling alliances. We want to avoid foreign wars. We need to maintain our own business. I mean, I've always kind of been, maybe it's my Midwestern roots. You do you, I do me, and we leave each other alone, and there can be peace. It's also no accident that even when I was a kid, my favorite poem was by Robert Frost, and it's The Mending Wall. Good fences do make good neighbors. stay out of other people's business, even if you're well-intentioned, because then you end up being like Gladys Kravitz, always spying, always trying to meddle, and thinking that you're better than everybody else. I mean, that mentality throughout human history has always brought trouble. I mean, if we're going to look at things clearly, we have to look in the context of where things are now and not hindcast our own values back onto the past. Conservative Americans, particularly conservative white Americans, have no idea, no understanding of the context in which the Declaration or the Constitution were actually written in the late 18th century. They ought to have a little more humility and accept that we're in a different mode, in a different society. We ought to think more independently and chart a new course forward, given these historical circumstances.
Just wanted to remind the chat that when they look up, they see a face like mine looking down at them from the screen. Okay, I feel better now. So I've been watching this French TV show Spiral on Amazon Prime. It's an excellent police procedural. And the legal system in France is very different from the Anglo-Saxon system. And I don't know much about the French legal system, but I do know something about our Anglo-Saxon system in America. And I'm starting to have more and more sympathy for the French system as opposed to our Anglo-Saxon system. I served on a jury once, and the guy accused of drunk driving was a black man about age 30. He blew a couple of different DUI tests, showed he was clearly intoxicated, but 2 black women on the jury would not convict him because they said there are enough black men in jail. Similarly, there are Jews who would never vote to convict a Jew, and I would assume that there are Chinese Americans who would similarly look out for the interests of their co-ethnics. I think 50 or 100 years ago there'd be a higher percentage of Jews than now who would not be willing to convict a fellow ethnic who's accused of a crime. So obviously the Anglo-Saxon legal system is not going to work. A jury of your peers, when the jury is going to be multiracial, is just simply not going to work very well in some circumstances. So I'm beginning to have some increasing sympathy for the French system. I don't know if its legal criminal justice system works more effectively than ours. It's hard to believe that it is less effective. But again, it depends on a context. So the United States at the time of the War of Independence was 85% from England. So a type of judicial system and a legal system that works for that population is not going to work as well for a very different population, such as what America has now. Let me play more from Paul Gottfried.
In terms of the contemporary debate, I think it's the whole thing is pretty silly. But I think that the left does raise a good question. You know, how were the people who wrote this? How would they understand? The other point that you made, I think, is very interesting. That there are people, in fact, who are on the say they're on the right. They're young people, but they buy into most of the same arguments as the left. This is something.
Gandalf, you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to say this is exactly right. I mean, the kind of Anglo jurisprudential system that relied on the common jury of your peers, you know, that didn't even go over well with a lot of other European groups, much less the Ottos group, the Americans descended of slaves. I think you know, a lot of Americans still are, because they bought into the myth of exceptionalism and this morality play about America stemming from the Cold War, because we're the quote-unquote free world and the communist world is the quote-unquote unfree world, that very simple Manichaeanism. We don't really look at a lot of the particularities of our legal system that are rooted in our English past. And even for many European Americans, that past is not our deep past. And I think we have to think very carefully about reevaluating what kind of legal system we're going to have, because you know the support for the legal system among all demographics from a political legitimacy perspective is in decline. I mean, I think there was a study showing that Like the FBI, just a couple of decades ago, had like 70-80% approval rating. Now it's down to 50%. I mean, I'm extremely concerned that all of these institutions are losing legitimacy. Some of the reasons are endogenous to the institutions themselves, meaning their own behavior within the social space, but a lot of it has to do with just the increasing incoherence of society. And, I want peace, order, and prosperity, and that requires both a virtuous citizenry and legitimate institutions. And our legal system right now is in a lot of trouble because I think people are doubting it more and more. And I think the kind of questions you're raising vis-a-vis this French procedural and comparing it to American jurisprudence is extremely prescient and relevant.
Looking at the New York Post, Robert Williams identified as alleged Bronx NYPD precinct shooter. The alleged gunman who shot up an NYPD station house in the Bronx early Sunday, been identified by police as Robert Williams, a career criminal with busts including homicide. Walked into the 41st precinct around 8 a.m. and opened fire in a wild scene caught on video. He was also responsible for a Saturday night ambush of 2 cops sitting in a marked patrol van nearby, hitting one of them with a round that nearly struck his carotid artery. So let's go to the video here from New York Post. Okay, Gandalf, I know you need to go in 5 minutes. Do you have any final words?
Yeah, final words. So thanks for having me come on your show. I enjoy waking up to Sunday morning. I'm hoping I add some intelligent contributions. I'm glad you're playing a lot of Paul Gottfried stuff. I respect him a lot as an intellectual. I love the direction the show is taking, and I look forward to seeing and talking with you a lot next week. And take care, Luke, and take care, everyone in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Gandalf. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Right, I'm going to go back to Christopher de Groot here, writing in Tacky Mag. Nor should one expect anything besides functional opposition to come from First Things. Although the magazine has moved to the populist right, it means the weak careerist outlet it has always been can be seen from its recent politically correct smearing of Sam Francis. People who don't work in conservative journalism may not realize how very common it is for the right to simply hand the left a victory, to go down, as it were, without any fight. Let me tell you a story. May of 2018, I had an essay accepted by the website The Imaginative Conservative. The essay argued for the value of prejudice, in the Burkean sense of wisdom from the past, as opposed to that of diversity. It also made a case for cultural homogeneity. A few days after the essay was published, a silly fellow on Twitter claimed that I was calling for discrimination against blacks and other victim groups. He did not quote my words or provide any support for his hysterical interpretation. Nevertheless, in response to the complaint, the website promptly removed the essay. Afterward, I looked into the Free Enterprise Institute, the non-profit foundation that publishes The Imaginative Conservative. The Institute's board of trustees includes Senator Ted Cruz, Robert McNair, Chairman Emeritus and CEO of the Houston Texans, other powerful and well-connected persons whose contacts and connections probably account for the website's funding. In general, money men are rather fearful of bad publicity, and it was just that fear that led The Imaginative Conservative to remove my essay. But there is a terrible price to pay for such conformity, namely living an inauthentic life and possibly losing the culture war. Make no mistake, achieving victory in this war depends on collective action. Some people may realize their individual interests by selling out the right in America to the perpetually aggrieved left. Any number of gatekeeping editors can maintain their cushy lifestyles by submitting to the left in the manner of Sohrab or Mari.
Ow!
Oh!
Cut my finger! Ow, Tina!
Okay. Whoa. Whoa. Those videos. Okay. You can maintain your cushy lifestyle submitting to the left in the manner of Sohrab Amari and the Imaginative Conservative. Though such persons are quite evidently willing to live lives without intellectual principle, it will take much greater character than theirs for the right to defeat the narcissistic left. Christopher de Groot, writing in Tacky Mag. Go back to Paul Gottfried.
I've been noticing, because they went to the same schools and grew up in the same culture. So, you turn on Fox News, there's a lady who's a lesbian and a feminist, but feels that things have gone a little too far. she's a star conservative. You see her on every program on Fox. Now, if you're an older person watching this, what is going to be your impression? It's, if Tammy Bruce is a lesbian and a second-wave feminist, these aren't bad things, because she's a Republican and she supports Trump.
She's actually a Democrat, but she supports Trump.
Right. She supports Trump. So you're not really offended by this anymore, right? Or, there's another person on who is transgendered, but who objects to having transgendered men competing in women's race. Well, this is a good transgendered person. And this transgendered person might have voted for Trump. So just watching these people, you decide that, maybe I was against something that's pretty good, being gay or transgendered. I think this is the impression that an older person might get from watching Fox News. It's not that, gee, this is terrible stuff. How dare they put? No, these are pretty good people, and they voted for the same candidate that I did, right? And they don't like the Democrats right now. So, and the fact that they're gay, this is fine. Maybe I misjudged these people in the past. Maybe we should have had gay marriage in 1940 or something like that. So I think what it does is habituate people to these radical lifestyles if the people who are being brought in express the same voting preference.
Looking at what Gallup asked people about what they're proud of in America, there were, across the board, Republicans, but at the same time, culturally, it doesn't really mean much more than to say you're from the Balkans. It can mean almost anything. And that's very, very bad for a country in the long run when there's such a lack of fraternity among its citizens.
Yeah, no, I think the 32%, though, sort of looking at that raises the question, are all these people unhappy with the government for the same reasons? And I doubt it. Democrats are unhappy because they cannot stuff the Supreme Court with their own guys or ladies or lesbians, whatever they want to put there, right? So, to balance off the presence of Kavanaugh or somebody they don't like, or Clarence Thomas, the Republicans are unhappy because they lost the Congress, right, the House of Representatives. So they might be unhappy for different reasons right now. The 32% does not surprise me because, as you said, it's a polarized, balkanized country, and people, are unhappy with the government, but are unhappy for different reasons. One of the things I find remarkable listening to this conservative Republican propaganda is that we're supposed to be proud of the wonderful culture we're sending to Europe, like rap music. I'm actually proud of this. I mean, if we were producing Mozart, why this? I mean, this is incredible. Things we should be ashamed of, we're supposed to be proud of. So it's you want to find something to be proud of. So you look all around the place. It's like anything that's American is good. Anything that comes from here is better than anything that comes from somewhere else. I think that it's one thing to say, that more Europeans read American books or watch American television than vice versa. That we are culturally dominant because of our power, right? And we are the great power in the world, economically, politically, and what happens here is more important than what happens. It doesn't mean the quality is necessarily better. It just means that you're dealing with a more influential society that affects the lives of more people than any other society on Earth. People want to come to the United States because it is the great world power. It is the center of everything. So they come here. It doesn't mean that our music is necessarily better, that our rap artists, whatever they're called, vocalists, should be praised as an American, or horrible movies that I've seen. This is somehow an achievement, comparable to the art of Michelangelo or something. So I think a lot of this pride is just stupid. I mean, people, it's very indiscriminate. It's anything that's produced here is somehow better. One of the things I've argued for a long time is that whatever the problems of ethnic nationalism or ethnic patriotism or nationhood, alternatives to it aren't necessarily nicer or work better. One thing that sort of, that I could understand is something like the Habsburg Empire. You have all these different nationalities. They're loyal to the emperor, to his person, or British Empire. They're loyal to the monarch. I mean, this to me is sort of innocuous, sort of nice, innocuous patriotism. But when you start to say, we have an ideal, or this which makes us exceptional, and we are required to give this to everyone, or when there's so little holding it together, and you're groping for things that make you exceptional or better, like rap music or horrible movies or something like that, with which you poison other countries. You sort of have to wonder, if the game hasn't gone too far. I find the whole business about, we are exceptional, talking and making this a criterion of who is a traditionalist or conservative is ridiculous. I mean, I think it's totally anti-traditional to believe anything like that. It's just silly, childish boastfulness, as far as I can see.
Okay, I'm seeing an interesting Twitter thread right now. We go to video here. I think this is President Trump during the debates. So Requiem's Imperium says this was the single greatest moment in post-Cold War U.S. politics. So let's have a look
the war in Iraq. A big fat mistake. All right. Now you can take it any way you want, and it took Jeb Bush, if you remember at the beginning of his announcement, when he announced for president, took him 5 days. He went back. It was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It took him 5 days before his people told him what to say. And he ultimately said it was a mistake. The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. We don't even have it. Iran is taking over Iraq with the second largest oil reserves in the world. Obviously, it was a mistake. So George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty. We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East.
But so you still think he should be impeached?
I think it's my turn, isn't it?
You do whatever you want. You call it whatever you want. I want to tell you, they lied. Okay. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass destruction.
Okay. All right. Governor, when a member on the stage's brother gets attacked,
I got about
gets
5
to
or 6. Do I get to do it 5 or 6 times, or just once
nice.
responding to that? So here's the deal. I'm sick and tired of Barack Obama blaming my brother for all of the problems that he's had. And frankly, I could care less about the insults that Donald Trump gives to me. It's blood sport for him. He enjoys it, and I'm glad he's happy about it. But I am sick and tired of him going after my family. My dad is the greatest man alive in my mind. And while Donald Trump was building a reality TV show, my brother was building a security apparatus to keep us safe, and I'm proud of what he did. And he's had the gall to go after my mother.
The World Trade Center came down.
He's had the gall to go after my mother.
Remember that.
Hold on.
Let me finish this. He's had the gall to go after my mother.
That's not keeping
Look, I
us
won
safe.
the lottery when I was born 63 years ago and looked up and I saw my mom. My mom is the strongest woman I know.
She should be running.
This is not about my family or his.
Jeff says that when he was born, when he looked up, it was his mother's face looking down at him. Beautiful. Okay, now in response to that video, Roy Cam tweets, partially castrated white man, especially partially castrated upper-class elite, just suckers waiting to be taken in by anybody with street smarts. Felt it as a kid going to my Quaker private school. Hate to say it because on a personal level, I like George H.W. Bush and his son. How can a family have spent generations dealing with the people of OPEC and completely misinterpret and misunderstand the nature of Islam? The acid test is the understanding of the Crusades. Once you reject the Crusades as a valid defense of the West, however imperfectly and immorally conducted, you are a sucker. A big friggin' sucker waiting to hand the keys to the kingdom of the West to our enemies.
I know I sound like somebody on CNN, but as someone on CNN until the Democrats win, then they might change their party line. But I've always, since I was a kid, I thought this was nonsense, this running around saying we're exceptional. It always reminded me of people who came here from Europe like poor Italians or poor Jewish refugees after World War II and so forth. This is the greatest country. Yes, it is the great. It's like you're trying to convince yourself, 10,000% American. And I remember hearing this as I grew up they were refugee society. I grew up and they'd all escaped, before the Second World War. And it was, isn't this the great, they could barely speak English. It's the greatest. It's just like, it's just such nonsense, fine, you like it, stay here. Okay. But it's like you have to convince yourself that you're like 1,000% American.
Keith Saylor has the best response to this type of thinking. He says, yeah, America is the greatest for me because I live here. This is where I come from. You'd expect someone who lives here to have a long history here, to have been born and raised here, to regard America as the greatest, just as you'd expect someone to think similarly about Fiji or Japan, depending on their circumstance.
And when the neoconservatives do it, I always have that sense that they really don't think they're all Americans purely. So you have to convince yourself by saying, by engaging in this exceptionalist stuff. But I've always found this to be an extremely tiresome ritual.
I think that if you look at the Gilded Age.
Okay, guys, it's time for that most exciting time of the show. Think about how many lives have been saved by this minion. All right, think about how many people have gotten clean through this minion. Think about all the people who have had a new experience with the Ribono Shel Olam through this minion. Think about all the Jews now keeping Shabbos and Kashrut and Taharas Mishpacha thanks to this minion. Think of all the effective lobbying that we have done for Israel. Think about how we've made anti-Semitism illegal on college campuses thanks to this minion. Think about all the Goyim who have learned the Sheva mitzvahs B'nai Noach thanks to this minion. So if the Lord moves on your heart in a particular way, feel free to financially support this minion so that we can go on with our world transforming work. My PayPal is lukeisback@gmail.com. All right, very exciting. Nathan Koffner's paper here, Research on Group Differences in Intelligence, a Defense of Free Inquiry. In a very short time, it is likely we will identify many of the genetic variants underlying individual differences in intelligence. We should be prepared for the possibility that these variants are not distributed identically among all geographic populations. This explains some of the phenotypic, pheno is how a gene shows itself, demonstrates itself, phenotypic differences in measured intelligence among groups. However, some philosophers and scientists believe that we should refrain from conducting research that might demonstrate the partly genetic origin of group differences in IQ. Many scholars view academic interest in this topic as inherently morally suspect or even racist. The majority of philosophers and social scientists take it for granted that all population differences in intelligence are due to environmental factors. The present paper argues that the widespread practice of ignoring or rejecting research on intelligence differences can have unintended negative consequences. Social policies based on environmentalist theories of group differences may fail to achieve their aims. Large swaths of academic work in both the humanities and the social sciences assume the truth of environmentalism and are vulnerable to being undermined. We have failed to work through the moral implications of group differences to prepare for the possibility that they will be shown to exist. Nothing demonstrates this more than the coronavirus. What if the media told us the truth, that so far, to the best of my knowledge, please correct me if there's evidence contrary, everyone who has died of the coronavirus has been of the Chinese race. Not all races are equally susceptible to death from certain viruses. Different races respond differently to altitude. Different races respond differently to medication. Different races have different levels of high blood pressure where it becomes dangerous or not dangerous. Different races seem to have different susceptibility to things like diabetes and to various tropical diseases. So think about how much better off we would be if the news media felt safe to tell us the truth. Tell us the truth about group differences and the truth about how different diseases affect different groups. This is such basic information that I am relaying, and yet you'll never find it in the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, ABC News, CBS News, NBC News. Why don't they tell you about how the coronavirus does appear to discriminate on racial basis when it comes to death. It seems to me to be a very important mission to share with people.
And that was the best time, I think, economically to be an American, because then, without exact loyal to being a creature of the past.
You know, I think you're absolutely right. And I think if you look back, there are things that are genuinely admirable about the United States. I don't mean to demean the country. It's just this phony, blown up, pseudo nationalism that we're now living with that I find so disgusting. But I agree with you. I look at these Rockwell paintings. There is a truth in them, like the Vermont town hall where these people come and vote. It's an example of Jeffersonian democracy, which once existed in the United States. When it was a decentralized country, we had leaders in towns, when the towns had a certain kind of autonomy and a kind of history behind them, and were able to allowed to practice self-government. That did exist at one time. And we say people could come to this country and make.
And there are lots of questions in the chat about Kevin Michael Grace. When will he start his own show? So follow Kevin Michael Grace on Twitter, according to his last tweets, that now plans to start his own show on Monday. But stay tuned to his Twitter account for the latest.
A fortune because it was a free enterprise system. I think that's admirable. So these are really admirable. It's not because of all men are created equal. It's because there were conditions in this country that deserve admiration. And they exist only, I think, vestigially by now. But, at one time, like even growing up in the 1950s, you could still see the remnants of these things in the United States.
It's a shame that they are the remnants, but I mean, what can you do? What's past is past. You can't, as the Great Gatsby said, you can't repeat the past. Any thoughts on that?
I generally agree with what you've said. I think that what the right believes about what makes them nationalistic about America, I think, is largely feeling. Then you get the conservative movement, which tries somehow.
Well, nationalism is based on feeling, not rational. It's based on a feeling that you share common origins and a common destiny with a particular group of people. So if you want to understand nationalism, read the poetry and listen to the music of a particular people. That's the way to understand national feelings.
So to give us a rational form that we're really proud of as a propositional nation. I doubt these people think very much about a propositional nation. This is what Straussian intellectuals would like us to believe. It makes America unique is its propositional nationhood. But I think people who are patriotic, this is my experience, they're patriotic, and there also is this less pleasant side of it. These people, what I see as a kind of bumptious nationalism, like we're better, we're more excited, this sort of stuff. And as I first encountered this among socially insecure refugees living in the United States, which I think has permanently imprinted my consciousness and accounts for my view of why I find this so obnoxious.
Well, it's sort of like he's not a refugee, but Sebastian Gorka, when he makes
he's awful. He's the worst. He's awful.
His catchphrase is like, "We as Americans, we."
It's like the German scientist who worked for the Nazis now he's working for the Americans. I can't stand this man. Remove him from my site with that phony British accent.
Well, that's another thing. He really, if he said "we as Britons" or "we as subjects of the British Crown," even that you have to cringe. It's just not. He's not a man, I think, with a very firm identity. I'll put it that way.
No.
It's interesting, but he definitely is someone who I think is sort of like a personification of the issues that you raised before.
Yeah, right. He is, yes.
And it's unintentionally funny for us, but I think that he and those like him take it rather seriously, or maybe they don't. As someone who has much more experience with this demographic than I do, what's your impression?
No, I think you're right, and that's my impression. But did you mention this fellow named Steve Hilton, who's on there?
Oh, yes.
He's another one. He's sort of a populist. There's like nothing in the populism. It's like we're not allowed to be, an ethnicity of this, and we just have to be. We just have to be the people, whatever that is. And then he has a propositional nationhood. We're people because of all men are created equal, or something like that. But there's like nothing in it. There's like no pop or fizz or anything in his populism.
It's a bizarre situation.
Okay, let's go to Steve Bannon's appearance on Bill Maher.
He's Trump's former White House chief strategist and the co-host of the War Room Impeachment and War Room Pandemic podcasts. Steve Bannon has agreed to come by again. Great man, Steve. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for being polite. Okay, Steve, so look, I'm not going to lie about it. Your boy had the best week so far, don't you think?
His last 2 weeks. I think you see the culmination
All right, I admitted it. Don't gloat.
No, but I think this shows you the actions he's been taking the entire time. It's not just the impeachment. It's the Middle East peace plan. It's what he's doing on opioids. It's USMCA. It's Brexit. One action after another.
Okay, but Steve, as a student of history, which I know you are, nothing this week bothered you? Like yesterday when we find out now that he's, you know, the thing he said about Comey, we'll see what happens. If it was Obama, people would be in jail. Vindeman gets frog marched out. Mitt Romney is a suppressive person. This is very von Stauffenberg, isn't it? After the coup failed, no. You don't think it's an enemies list kind of situation that doesn't make you a little nervous? You trust him with that power?
No, absolutely. In fact, here's what I've.
Very von Stauffenberg. I don't recall any of these people getting killed. They are simply being removed from their jobs. Seems like the most normal, natural, and healthy response is absolutely no equivalent to what Hitler did to those who opposed him, to those who plotted to kill Hitler, then Hitler plotted and executed them. No, zilch comparison to what Trump is doing by getting rid of the Vindman brothers from the White House.
Argued from day one, we should have had a longer impeachment. We should have had Bolton. You should have had Mulvaney. You should have had all the OMB memos. Witnesses. Let them get crossed. But we get the whistleblower. We get the second whistleblower. We get Schiff as a fact witness. Let's get it all out. If this is not, and Trump says this, it's just not about Trump. This is about going forward the office of the president. If Bernie gets in and you're his advisor, trust me, the same thing's going to happen. If you think the neoliberal, neocon, national security apparatus is just going to sit there and let Bernie as commander-in-chief make the decisions that he's empowered to as commander-in-chief, they're going to fight him every step of the way, and that's why this thing has to be vetted. The abuses of the FBI and the CIA in the 50s and 60s culminated in the Church Commission in the 70s. That's what we need today. I think the Senate Judiciary Committee ought to start calling witnesses. We got to get to the bottom of the 40 subpoenas that were out there by the House Intel. We've got to you ought to declassify this, Crossfire Hurricane, and let Bolton, let Mulvaney, let them all talk. Let's get all the emails out there. Let's see the whole thing.
Okay, when you say Crossfire Hurricane, the liberal audience doesn't have the decoder ring for that one. That's just Fox News. Yeah, I know.
It's an FBI. It's the FBI.
I know.
Right. But no, if they don't know it, they should. Listen, this is about civil liberties. This is about protecting the office of the president. Your audience should know that, and that's why it's got to be official apparatus.
Okay, Steve, I can't even. But let's go back to history, because he used words like scum.
Oh no!
Horrible people.
Oh no! He used words like scum and horrible people. So what? You use words like that every time, and I'm a man of God.
Evil people.
He has a different house style.
Okay,
but he's right.
But we've seen. Excuse me. We've seen this house style before. When you talk about people like that, when you're a cult leader like that who has millions of people. Wait a second. He has millions of people who would obviously do anything for him, and now we only have loyalists in the.
Okay, so if you use words like scum or evil, you're a member of a cult or the leader of a cult. Makes sense to me.
Government. Okay, so when you talk,
that's not true.
Well,
that's where people were terminated today. Many of the people on that list,
because they're just not loyalists. They're good people.
No, it's not loyalists. Remember, a commander-in-chief has the rights. The whistleblower and other guys like that were on the list that people that worked around me put together in April of 2017. Steve. These detailees, a commander-in-chief, whether it's Bernie Sanders, AOC, or Donald Trump, have the right to have people around them that believe in their policies and their program. It's not about loyalty.
Okay, these are people who we didn't even know existed. They were deep state people. Deep state meaning competent people who actually make the government work, who are nonpartisan.
I'm not a believer in the deep
state. Steve, let me get to question 2.
Okay.
Because we only have so much time. Okay.
Bill, you're a terrible questioner. You can't make all these outrageous statements and then say, let me get to my question. All right? That's not how it works. If you have a question, then pose the question without moral judgments in the question. You can't say these outrageous things and then claim, oh, let me get to my question.
We've seen this in other countries. When you talk about people like they're scum and they're evil,
we've had that rhetoric in Anglo-Saxon countries. In every country has that type of rhetoric for thousands of years. There's no clear correlation between that rhetoric and mass murder. This is just fantasy on the part of Bill Maher. Bill Maher is quite derogatory regarding people that he disagrees with.
We've seen it in Rwanda, cockroaches. We've seen it in Germany, vermin.
Right, yeah, Rwanda and Germany. It was calling people cockroaches. That's what caused the genocide, rather than the cockroach expression being a symptom of incompatibility between two groups. Right? When resources are limited, human desires are infinite. When there's not going to be any peace until one group is dominant, then you are going to have conflict.
You don't think that when you talk about people like that, your side, the people who hear those words, you don't think eventually it translates into action? They see people on our side as less than worth.
No, absolutely not.
No, you can refer to people as scum all day long and it doesn't lead to violence. For example, Jews are far more verbally violent than any other people of which I am aware. They also have about the lowest rates of criminal violence. So on the one hand, Jews extraordinarily high in verbal violence, extraordinarily low in criminal violence. So no necessary correlation. In fact, you can provide plenty of evidence that the correlation runs in the opposite direction. That when people feel free to express their true feelings, that they are less likely to engage in criminal violence.
Why? Because we have the precedents I just mentioned. Why is it not like it?
Oh, so you cherry pick a couple of genocides and say we have these precedents. Well, what about the thousands of examples where people use language equivalent to scum and there was no massive explosion of criminal violence? What about those precedents, Bill? Guy is such a shallow thinker.
You don't see
cockroaches, scum.
No.
Vermin.
You don't. Listen, you don't see
not
any,
the same.
You don't see any actions of the deplorables or people doing that. Listen,
it wasn't the calling of people cockroaches that caused the genocide. It was a fundamental clash of interests that caused the genocide. It wasn't the rhetoric. The rhetoric was the expression of this fundamental conflict of interests that had grown to extreme levels.
For the last 3 years, Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic Party have sat there and said, we have to protect the country. Donald Trump said clear and present danger against Russian oligarchs. The Democratic Party today is looking to be saved by an oligarch. This thing is total hypocrisy.
Talking about Bloomberg.
I'm talking about Bloomberg, an American, a moderate Republican
very
mayor,
rich guy.
$71 billion,
Yes, I agree.
a super rich guy. And he's going to put billions of dollars to destroy Donald Trump. So the
run against him.
Okay, so the chat says, not from presidents, Luke. No president has used that kind of language in public. So I don't have the rhetoric of all American presidents present in my head right now. I doubt that is true. I doubt that is true. I'm sure you could find all sorts of extreme rhetoric from many presidents, and it has not been accompanied by some massive outbreak of criminal violence.
He's not running against him.
He's not running against him. What is he doing?
It's a leverage battle of the Democratic Party. He's already said, I will put $2 billion of capital in back of any candidate to defeat Trump.
Okay, one side always has more money than the other.
This is not about more money.
It's not about more money because the last time Trump had way less money and he won.
Absolutely.
Sort of.
You know why? Because Trump...
All right.
That's nonsense. He won, and he won bigly, Bill. Bigly.
But...
It's that mentality that has you in this place today. And the place today is Trump is about to run the tables.
Yeah, exactly. So this type of thinking embodied by Bill Maher does not make for an effective life. So let's say you play a game on Friday and your opponent defeats you as decisively as Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton in 2016. So your opponent beats you 28-17 in a football game. And you say, well, they beat us we had more rushing yards than they did. But that's not how a game is decided. A football game is not decided by the team that has the most rushing yards. It's decided by the team who has the most points. So if you cling to this idea that we really won, even though the score was 28-17, we really won because we had the most rushing yards, that is not a mindset that's going to produce future victories. That is a mindset that is going to produce future defeats. So what Bill Maher exhibits here is a mindset that's going to build for lack of success in life. denying that you were soundly thrashed in 2016 means that you're denying reality. That you are choosing to exempt yourself from reality to live in a fantasy world, which is fine if you want to spend some time in fantasy, but it very quickly becomes maladaptive daydreaming. What Bill Maher has is clearly maladaptive, denying reality, going to make him and his side less effective. He's catering to his base, telling them what they want to hear, but that is going to render him and those who listen to him less effective because they are not in reality.
You have a totally divided Democratic
I agree
Party.
with that.
No, because nobody sat there after 2016 and said, why did we lose? The same arrogance you saw in the people in Brooklyn that would not send Hillary Clinton to Michigan. And to, remember, Michael Moore always makes the point, I think there's 70,000 down-ticket votes in Michigan that didn't vote for a president. The reason is Trump reached out to these working-class people and connected with them. Okay? And Clinton, it's the same arrogance you see in Iowa about this app.
Yes, there is that. But we mostly lose because a senator in Wyoming represents 290,000 people, and a senator here represents 20 million. That's mostly why we lose. The electoral.
The electoral college. So the whole system is the reason you lose. So again, not an effective way of dealing with reality. Okay, that if you want to change the electoral system, you've got a very steep uphill climb, when in fact you've got the demographics steadily moving in your favor. So why do you want to fight unnecessary wars? Why do you want to deny reality simply because it feels good and it fires up your base? You want to overthrow the political system of the United States, the one that we've basically had in place for 240 years? Doesn't seem effective to me.
Electoral college.
No, it's called a republic, sir.
It's called a republic with a very flawed foundation. Is it really democratic for one person to?
Is there any republic without a flawed foundation? Is there any system of government without a flawed foundation? Is there any individual who does not have, at least in part, a flawed foundation? There's no individual without flaws. There's no political system without flaws. But Bill Maher, like Republican talk show hosts, is just feeding his base, feeding them fantasies, make them feel good, to make them support him, but also renders them less effective, less in reality.
What I love about you guys, you've got to whine about everything.
Whine?
Look, the game is, it's match play, not medal play.
No,
win it match play.
I understand what the rules are.
Show me you could win. No, you know what the rules are and you can't win.
You're right.
You've had
You're right. You're
Bill,
right. Hillary should have gone to Wisconsin because it's an electoral college game. I've admitted that many times. That's not the point. You said, why do you win?
No.
You win because the game is rigged for you. I get it.
Absolutely not. It is absolutely not.
The electoral college. Okay. All right.
Okay, if the game is rigged for you, it's been rigged that way for 200 years, Bill.
Steve,
hold it. With this attitude, the beauty, we're going to keep winning. We're going to keep winning. I love this.
I know you do.
Guys
I know you do.
How can you sit here? How can you sit here and have an oligarch, a Republican oligarch, that is going to be the salvation of the Democratic Party? Okay, it's outrageous. You guys have screwed. Okay. Well, Bernie's been screwed by the Democratic Party. Look at the last week. They wouldn't allow the poll to be released where he was up 4. Okay, then they do this thing as soon as the whole debacle about the count. As soon as he starts closing in, the Democratic Party says, "Hey, let's have a recanvass." Okay. The Bernie voters are to do what they did in 2016. Right. We've had a belly full of the Clintons. Come either don't vote or come vote for Trump.
I understand why you're against Bernie. Yes, I mean
I like Bernie.
And the chat says, Luke, the American political system has been constantly changed over the past 230 years. Yeah, many parts of it have changed. Guess what's not changed? Election via electoral college has not changed. 240 years. This basic system, this basic Republican system has not changed in that respect. That's the respect that Bill Maher is arguing against. Doesn't seem very effective tactic for winning, but again, Bill Maher is less interested in winning than he is in self-aggrandizement in telling his base things that they want to hear.
Too much socialism?
I like Bernie.
Really? You want socialism in
No,
America?
no. He's a populist.
Right. He's a socialist.
I don't agree. I don't agree with his solutions. I think a lot of.
That's kind of a big part of politics.
No. The biggest part. One of the biggest parts is identifying the problem. I think Bernie's identified the problem. We just
Trump
have
and
different
him
solutions.
shared some voters because they both kind of go after the same problem. You're right.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm just saying.
The Bernie people are help make Trump president.
But you don't
they're going to
want-
help make him president again.
Even
Because
I
he's
don't
been
want that.
screwed by the Democratic Party.
Even I don't want that amount of socialism. I agree we need, well, not agree, I think we need some amount of socialism. I call it capitalism plus. We already have a lot of socialism. But
we don't have a good form of capitalism
okay,
right
but
now. We
wait,
have oligarchs and
that's
serfs.
true.
The millennials are like Russian serfs. They don't own anything, and they're not going to own anything. We have to redefine that. That's the central part that we have to do.
But whose policies are responsible for that? This bait and switch you guys pull all the time. Just let me say one thing. It is a bait. Of course it is.
No.
Wait a second. Wait, just let me say one thing. Just let me say one thing.
Please spare me. The Democratic Party is owned by Wall Street and the corporate interests. Look what they're doing.
How obnoxious is Bill Maher? Let me say one thing. He is doing the majority of the talking. He's saying these outrageous statements and then demanding that there be no response with the proviso, let me ask my question. Okay, he is deluded.
The corporate interests. Oh God forbid the corporate ever get their tentacles into the Republican Party. That would be a bad day. Okay, but let me ask you this: who's the real?
We had 4 years to solve this problem, and now you're divided.
Who's the real socialist? Trump's bailout of the farmers, $28 billion. Obama's bailout of the auto industry was $12 billion. Why is it socialism when Obama does it, but not when Trump does it? And why is Trump has run up a much bigger debt, much bigger deficits than Obama when the Tea Party was out there? What happened to that? Why? So I think that the solution to the rising debt is a white president.
Excuse me?
I think the solution to the rising debt is a white president because it was a terrible problem when Obama was president, and now it is no problem at all.
When did the Democrats get interested in deficits or debt? If you look at the modern monetary theory that underpins Warren, underpins Bernie, underpins AOC,
but Trump's doing worse
guys are looking at quantitative.
Trump's doing worse at it.
Yeah, Barack Obama was forced by the Tea Party to restrict spending. So if you look at Barack Obama's spending, it was dramatically curtailed after 2010 once the Tea Party came to Washington, D.C. So thanks to the Tea Party, federal government spending was, increases in federal government spending were limited, just as when Newt Gingrich and Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, federal government spending increases were limited from 1994 to 2000. When President Reagan was in office during those 8 years, the percentage of the federal economy that was controlled by the federal government dropped by 1 full percentage point from something like 20.4% to 19.4%. So, yeah, there have been reductions in government spending. It's not at all clear that Republicans are better for that than Democrats, but there have been contributions made by the Republicans to slowing the increase in government spending, reducing the percentage of government spending as far as the gross national product. So Reagan, for his high budget deficits, he did substantially reduce the size of the federal government's take of the national gross domestic product.
Trump's doing worse at it.
But here's the point. Hang on.
Yes, that's true. Trump is doing worse at it. Compared to Barack Obama, in those explicit terms, Trump is running up much bigger budget deficits.
With no protestation from the right. Where's
the growth over time is going to bring down the deficits.
the growth over time. I've been hearing about that since I Dream of Jeannie was on the air.
And pay for these tax cuts and pay for these tax cuts.
God.
But you guys are always trying to change the topic. Let's get down to the basics.
You taught Trump all these tricks, like to always turn it right around. Yes, you did.
No,
I know
he
you
had
did.
him long before he
taught
met
him a
me.
lot. You taught him in the word populist. Ha ha ha. You know, people who are against elites, like you.
Well, look at the Democratic Party's done to the populists. Look what they've
a light remark.
Look what they've done to the populists.
Steve, let me ask you this question. I read today some of the things that he said about you over the years. Just scathing. I mean, like, you know, the word dog figures into a lot of it. And we see this.
Look, I come from an Irish Catholic family with 5 kids. I've been called a lot worse around the dinner table.
Okay, but this is the
what
guy.
What he has to say, it's the signal and the noise. That's all the noise.
Really?
Okay? Look at the signal. Look at the signal of what he's done.
Is that whatever? Because he does this constantly to people. He just says the worst things about him, and they come back and eat his dog bowl.
No.
Why do they?
Because
the way people speak about you on occasion is not the only determining factor in your relationship with them. So you may keep some people in your life who say horrible things about you because overall they add to your life. They bring more to your life than they subtract from your life. Human relationships are somewhat complex, but they certainly don't boil down to just what do people say.
He's a transformative figure.
I see.
And historical.
Well, he
president.
is that. He is that. We're going right into dictatorship.
No.
It's a very it's
this
transformative.
This is why the progressive left in 2018 won a big victory, because you went door to door.
That's absurd that we're going into dictatorship under Donald Trump. Absurd.
Understand that Donald Trump, between changing the federal judiciary, deconstructing the administrative state, is going to be in their personal lives 10, 20, and 30 years from now. That is why the left goes door to door.
And a great comment in the chat. This is what men do. If you like each other, you insult each other. If I thought I could get away with it every time Ricardo came on the show, I'd insult him. I'd say, "Hey, homo, what's going on?" or something like that. So that's what men do when they like each other. They insult each other.
Door to door to beat him, and he's achieving his objectives. He said, now comes the hour of action in his inaugural address, and you see the actions coming together. And that's why we're sitting in February of 2020. He's united his party. He's got the economy on his side. And
it's his best week ever. That's what I said. Okay. I wish we had someone on our side.
Okay. So let's go back to Paul Gottfried.
Another question, this one from Bernard Wrightson for Paul. What are your 3 favorite novels?
That is almost impossible for me to answer. There's so many novels that I enjoy. I mean, if you ask me who are my favorite authors, I enjoy Faulkner is one of my favorite writers. I love American Southern literature. It's my favorite American literature. I'm also very fond of German writers, as everybody knows. I love German, French, Italian literature. Lampedusa's book, Il Gattopardo in Italian, The Leopard, is one of my favorite novels. And I recommend it to anyone in Italian or in English or whatever other language one chooses to read it. When I was younger, I was also a great fan of Stendhal, the early 19th century French novelist. So, I would have to say at the end of the day, there are many novelists whom I recommend. I've never been able to get into the novels of Cormac McCarthy, although I consider that perhaps a failing on my part. I just don't much care for his very severe style. But I'm assured by other people that he is a great novelist.
And now for the next 3 questions from Bonsai Cowboy. These usernames just get more and more interesting. And the first one, I believe, is for me. What are your thoughts on the EU, and how do you see its future? I think the EU has a very bad future. I don't think it is something that will exist, shall we say, in an organic society. It has to be propped up perpetually by various schemes within the EU itself, and then obviously various member states go along with those schemes. But I don't think that the European public really would approve of the EU as it is now.
His work, The Concept of the Political, the Begriff des Politischen, is one of the greatest works of political thought ever written.
Speaking here about Carl Schmitt.
And I think his discussion of friend-enemy distinctions as what he would say the essence or criterion, he would say the criterion of the political, I think is an absolutely brilliant insight. I'm also very much taken by his understanding of the sort of the end of the European nation state, where the nation state, which he sees as a specifically European creation, and the kind of chaos or alternate arrangements which have to follow the dissolution of the European state system. And he sees the state system as being specifically European. Does not think it really exists elsewhere. Finally, I would say that I am taken by Schmitt's historicism and his understanding, as he says in German, eine historische Wahrheit ist nur einmal wahr, that an historical truth is true only once, that one always has to examine political truths, particularly political truths, within a particular historical context, because they usually have no meaning beyond that, and rights can only be understood within particular historical frameworks. So in all of these insights, I think I'm perhaps a follower of Carl Schmitt, although I deplore, the political course that he took in May of 1933 when he joined the Nazi Party.
And this last question.
Okay, let me go back to the for Kofnes here, his essay on research on group differences in intelligence. The idea that all human groups have on average the same potential to develop all psychological traits and abilities is an empirically testable claim, but in some important ways it is unlike most other empirical claims investigated by scientists. Many scientists, philosophers, and even lay people hold that for a variety of reasons, we are morally obligated to affirm this proposition or refrain from conducting research that might undermine it. Prominent researchers who publicly endorse hereditarianism about group differences in intelligence, meaning that there's a genetic factor, have been condemned as immoral, fired from their positions, and physically threatened. Many scholars assume that there is no legitimate reason to be interested in group differences, that psychometricians focus on the IQ gap between some groups, for example, blacks and whites, rather than some others, North versus South Welsh, calls into question the motivation behind looking for such specific group differences in intelligence, sheds doubt on whether such research is well-founded, and begs whether answers could possibly be put to good use. In a society in which racism and sexism were absent, the questions of whether whites or men are more or less intelligent than blacks or women would not merely be meaningless, they would not even be asked. Virtually no scientific hypothesis besides race and sexual differences is rejected this way.
Question, I believe, is for me. Who is your favorite fiction writer? Probably F. Scott Fitzgerald, even though I'm not a big fiction guy. I also like Fitzgerald. He's one of my favorite writers, American writers. Wonderful. I would say great minds think alike, but my mind is not as great as yours. So, but yes, F. Scott Fitzgerald. I actually did like some of John Grisham's earlier novels, although I think his quality's declined quite a bit over the years, but very interesting. His earlier work was very interesting. So anyhow, moving on to questions for Paul from Laura O.C. I wonder if that means Orange County. But anyway, the first question is, did you agree with Edward Dutton's spiteful mutants argument for why Europeans are allowing mass migration into Europe?
With whose argument? Could you please repeat that?
Edward Dutton's.
Yeah. I don't think his explanation is sort of all-encompassing. It's not a sufficient explanation for what is happening, but I thought, as far as his explanation went, he was right.
Looking at an interesting story here on Gab right now. Utah sends employees to Mexico for lower prescription prices. Utah is paying public employees to travel to Mexico to fill their prescription medications, a program aimed at reducing the high cost of prescription drugs.
I think there's a variety of circumstances that explain the suicidal behavior, and it is suicidal behavior of Western Europeans at this point. But I certainly think something like the decline of masculinity is an important factor in understanding what's happening, or the decline in masculinity of what had been the ruling class before, because obviously Muslims who are coming in are extremely masculine. They have no problem, attacking this. They seem to have an excess of testosterone, but there seems to be a real deficiency of manhood in the leadership. One of the things you'll notice are how many women and how many lesbians are taking over, how many homosexuals are taking over control of European states, and I think that this really is attributable to a decline of masculinity. Whatever other explanations are true, religious crises, cultural crises, there does seem to be some kind of biological factor that has to be considered in trying to come up with a comprehensive understanding of what's happening in Europe.
And the second question for you is, Dave Smith has mentioned you, Paul, a couple of times on his podcast. He is an ANCAP like Tom Woods. Would you consider having him on the podcast or going on his podcast, Dave Smith's podcast, part of the problem?
Yes, I mean, why? Why would I refuse this gentleman the benefits of my conversation?
And Laura also says, "Keep up the great work. Keep up the great show / interviews, guys. Thanks a lot." Well, thank you very much, Laura. Very nice to hear from you. And now from James Lewis, questions for, I think it's just a question for Paul. Empire questions. Do you believe that we are near the end of the American empire? If so, can global capitalism in its current form survive the pulling back of American empire? Finally, how big of a threat is our national debt to our empire? I think it's sort of like one question with 3 parts, and it is for Paul, so please go ahead.
You know, I think at some point we are going to encounter an economic crisis. I think that because of enormous deficit spending, the fact that the Chinese have bought up so much of our currency and are also trying to are lending us money to pay for debts that we can't seem to handle at home. I think part of this is sort of in the nature of modern democracy, or as neoconservatives like to call it, liberal democracy, that you have an enormous welfariate or clientele for government favors. And at the same time, it seems politicians are doing very well that want to just open our borders, let more people come in, give them reparations, socialize medicine, and so forth. I think these problems are going to become a lot worse. I don't think they're going to become any better. Because the politicians who do well show absolutely no fiscal restraint. And for the record, however ineptly Donald Trump expresses himself, I don't think that is most of the reason why society is moving so radically to the left. Because the same thing is happening in just about every Western country right now. And I think it reflects the influence of the media, mass immigration, the educational system, and basically the breakdown of bourgeois Christian society, which had been there before for a very long time. So I do think we are headed for all kinds of economic crises. I don't think there'll be a sudden crash. I mean, I don't accept these apocalyptic endings. I think the United States will go on being, the only world power for a while, or the major world power. But I think these economic problems will become serious, and I think immigration is going to breed tremendous strife at home. Because I don't think it's going to be dealt with. I think it's going to become a lot worse. I think the left is going to win, quite possibly win the next presidential election. I'm not quite sure how Donald Trump is going to pull this out. But, there seems to be 51% or something of the people who are, seem happy with the Democrats. And what they want is just basically open borders. Something like this is happening in Germany. Very little pressure is being put on to control immigration in places like Sweden or Holland or even France. Despite the presence of the Rassemblement National and these other parties on the right. So I think we are headed for an immigration crisis. I think it's going to get worse. And I think that the demand for government programs and entitlements is probably insatiable. And more loans for colleges and give the kids more stuff. And this is just going to go on. And I think this will create an economic, a cultural crisis. And there will be a breakdown of civil order in the end.
Next question from Sino Shore 3425. This is for both of us. To both of you, do you think we are witnessing the end of the post-1960s egalitarian utopian vision as the multicultural project becomes increasingly untenable? Greater ethnic / societal conflict exacerbated by woke morality.
Okay, let me go back to the Nathan Kofnes essay. So my lights were falling down behind me. That's why I was jumping around. The fact that the majority of genetic variation in our species exists within rather than between races, as Lewontin discovered, does not rule out the possibility of significant race differences in psychological traits like intelligence. Lewontin argued that because there is more genetic variation within than between races, racial classifications do not correspond to any genetically based population structure. That implies there can be no genetically based racial classification. Thus, there can be no genetically based racial differences. Well, it needs to be very dramatic racial classification, very dramatic racial differences in who is dying from the coronavirus. So far, it is only people of the Chinese race, to the best of my knowledge, who have died from the coronavirus. So that's, over 700 people of the Chinese race who have died from the coronavirus, while other races who caught the coronavirus have recovered. This argument overlooks the fact that racial classification can be based on small differences in gene frequencies at multiple polymorphic loci. Looking at a single locus gives us almost no taxonomically useful information. Looking simultaneous at multiple loci allows us to classify people into ethnic groups with an accuracy that can approach 100%. So people who go to a crime scene and get DNA, just from that, they can determine the race of the person whose blood or whose tissue they find there. So obviously, racial differences can be detected at the DNA level. David Reich, who runs a leading genetics lab at Harvard University, recently acknowledged that Lewontin's argument has been used by geneticists to deliberately conceal the possibility of significant genetically based population differences. David says, "I have deep sympathy for the concern that genetic discoveries about differences among populations may be misused to justify racism. But it is precisely because of this sympathy that I am worried that people who deny possibility of substantial biological differences among populations across a range of traits, digging themselves into an indefensible position, one that will not survive the onslaught of science. The last couple of decades, most population geneticists have sought to avoid contradicting the orthodoxy. When asked about the possibility of biological differences among human populations, we have tended to obfuscate, making mathematical statements in the spirit of Richard Lewontin about the average difference between individuals from within any one population being around 6 times greater than the average difference between populations. This carefully worded formulation is deliberately masking the possibility of substantial average differences in biological traits across populations." That's David Reich from Harvard.
Creeping soft totalitarianism. Try to maintain it as Western countries continue to diversify. Not to mention potential economic woes. But so yes, that's what I think will come of all this. Paul?
Yeah, I'm trying to get back my picture. Okay. Yeah, I think the egalitarian project is going to go on and on. I think it is destructive. It will wipe out most of these societies. But you know, I'm doing a book right now on anti-fascism for Cornell University Press, and anti-fascism is doing extremely well. You know, it provides a kind of demon, and the illusion that if we do anything to stop the egalitarian project, we're all going to be in Auschwitz next week. So you know, I don't see this. I'm extremely pessimistic. I'm an old man already, but I remember growing up in the 1950s. People were normal. Society was normal. What I'm seeing, European countries were recovering from the war, but they looked relatively normal. What I'm seeing now is part of an historical process that may be irreversible. I'd like to think that my grandchildren will live in a better society. I doubt it. I really don't know how the dynamics of social, cultural radicalization, they demand that the government redistribute income not only to us, but to people who are coming in through open borders. I have no idea how this is going to end.
Okay, let's take a quick trip here down memory lane.
Like, come on, dude, that thing's off the rack and it doesn't fit you very well. So clearly you try to dress up, you have these effete affectations, but clearly you aren't like smart enough or cultured enough to actually do everything right. What kind of bourbon is in your Manhattan?
I love it cultured enough. First of all,
what kind of bourbon? What kind of bourbon?
It's Bullet Rye, which is just
okay. Yeah, that's what I thought. You are a monument to bourgeois taste, my friend.
Oh, okay. I thought it was classless earlier. Now I'm bourgeoisie.
Bourgeois. Yeah. Jesus.
Yeah, you're fucking. No, yeah, I mean, you're fucking retarded. And the fact is,
when I say you're a fucking bourgeois, what do you think I mean? You have elite affectations and you're fucking bourgeois as shit, and it bothers you.
You missed the.
What do you sell insurance, buddy? Are you a 1099?
That's what I do. I'm a 1099 to sell insurance. For State Farm. That's what I do. But yeah, you missed the part of the stream I was making fun of Luke earlier, and that's the whole reason I have the jacket on anyway. But no, I mean, I'm serious. Like, dude, I don't have to argue with it all. In 4 months, Richard Spencer is going to tank your shit.
Okay, this is Joaquim coming on my show about a year ago.
And I'm going to be right. I don't have to argue with you to be right. I just have to wait.
Okay, good for you. And in that meantime, 4 months could mean all sorts of really cool things happening. So
really.
We'll see. Maybe in 4 months I'll accept one of these job offers I've been doing. Maybe in 4 months I'll be able to retire with all the fucking e-grifter money that we're getting.
You're gonna be able to. No, you're not getting the grift, dude. Spencer's getting the grift.
You say that, and it's interesting because Spencer hasn't actually taken a cent from anything.
Just wait. I'm telling you, man. He's gonna tank your shit.
Yeah, what did Richard touch you in a naughty place? Like, I'm curious. I'm genuinely asking, why do you?
Yeah, he raped me like he raped a lot of women.
This is right to Bryden going up against Joaquim on my show about a year ago.
Well, there you go, I guess. I mean, was it like oral or was it anal? Like, did he just give you an unwelcome hand job? Or, like, how did Richard touch you?
He actually did come over and just grab my dick and started jerking me into completion. It was very uncomfortable. Look, dude, I'm just telling you, I don't have to argue with you. I don't.
No, I'm trying to. I've heard from so many people, and everyone keeps telling me how Richard is going to ruin my. Nobody has given me any specifics.
How everyone fucking tells you that. You idiot.
Calm down. It's okay.
You fucking retard.
Okay. You don't need pads out. You still have your alcohol, right? You're not about to start having the DTs.
Oh yeah. Oh my.
And this will be one of the rare times you'll hear me step in front of the mic, so if you could bear with me for a couple minutes, I have something I'd like to say. JF, this could have been you. But you backed down to be a milquetoast shell of what you pretended to be on Andy Worski's channel, and now you're more concerned about optics and your bank account than the goddamn message. You load your shows with chosen-night guests and take money from Jewish pedophiles, and then try and back it up by having the good doctor and Mr. Spencer on your show to think that you're about the message when you aren't. I've done the good Canadian thing too much in the past and stayed quiet. You're nothing but a thought with a beard and a smooth voice. You're no friend to the message we're trying to push, no matter how much you pretend you are. But what I'd really like to do is to address Nick Fuentes for a moment. Nick, this is coming from one content producer to another. You need to man the hell up and stop acting like a roid-using first baseman from San Francisco when the straight dope walks into the batter's box and keeps knocking him out of the park. You're so transparent, Nick. Everyone can see that you're scared. Scared of what, Nick? Scared of us. Because we're coming, Nick. You know how I know you're scared of us? You're punching down, Nick. You always step up into the big boy cages and try and knock them out of the park. But now you're coming at us. Somebody with half your subscribers get twice your reach, thinking you can step up to the T's and hit an easy double. But we're not a T-ball team, and you know it. And you're scared, Nick. You're scared that we have a bigger reach. You're scared that we have a bigger voice. And you're scared that we're going to eclipse you. And you're scared that you're right, because you are. You should be scared, because we're coming. We're coming hard. We're coming fast. And face it, kid, this is a train you cannot stop. Goodbye, Nick. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Heel Turn. Nail the colors to the cross with Joaquim Hawk, Richard Spencer, and Ronnie Cameron.
Nail the colors to the fucking mast, Jones. That's what I'm talking about right there. God damn, that was beautiful. I've been a little in the background lately, but some things.
Wow, that's some powerful content from the amazing Heel Turn Network. Wow. Man, remember the golden days of the Heel Turn Network. Man, that was some great stuff. I'm all kind of misty-eyed, but speaking of misty-eyed, let's remember when Brundlefly first graced this stream.
And I don't think it's a Jews are bad or Jews are better or worse. I think they're different. They're not totally compatible.
This is April 10, 2018.
Compatible all the time. They will come into conflict. So.
Now, what did your father teach you about Jews?
I would say that they're very, kind of people.
And how are your friendships with Jews? How are they different, say, than your friendships with non-Jews?
A little bit. Never. I was never in the inner circle, I would say. Part of the group, but never. Kind of, in school, a lot of times there's people that have been friends since they were 4 or 5 years old. Kids that were friends before they went to kindergarten, and that kind of bond lasts, is a lot deeper. And I think that goes back to, they're either cousins of cousins or they go to synagogue together. I mean, their parents were friends before we came into contact, kind of thing. So I think it's natural. I mean, I've never been screwed over by one or anything. So
now, did you get the message that it was not okay to publicly criticize Jews?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I will say that, I grew up in Montgomery County, Maryland, and there are a lot of Jews, and there's, in the shopping centers, they have menorahs, but not Christmas trees in a lot of places. And it kind of feels, it's a big place where Happy Holidays is said, and I mean, there is kind of a resentment of feeling like it's 2% of the population, yet they're constantly being catered to. We have school off for Rosh Hashanah, for Yom Kippur. You know, there was this incident one time in middle school. I used to doodle in the margins of my tests, and I just would draw shapes. And I guess like absentmindedly, I drew something within. I drew a swastika within a other geometric shape. And apparently, my teacher was Jewish. I didn't realize, and I got called in to the office and threatened with suspension because I was, you know, and I was really taken aback. I had no idea, but she felt like I was sending some message to her or threatening her with, you know, anti-Semitism. And it was like, look, I'm a kid. I have no idea. You know, I was just drawing shapes, and I felt I don't know. It was very.
Okay, as the chat says, luckily we de-radicalized Brundle. Otherwise, he would have been the second coming of Joseph Goebbels. Okay, that was Brundle's first appearance on the show, April 10, 2018. Back to Nathan Koffness here. David Reich addresses another common argument used to reject the possibility of substantial race differences. Even if there is genetically based variation affecting cognition or behavior, these differences must be small because so little time has passed since the separation of populations out of Africa. Finds this argument untenable in the light of recent findings in genetics. David Reich. The average time separation between pairs of human populations since they diverged from common ancestral populations, which is up to around 50,000 years for some pairs of non-African populations and up to 200,000 years or more for some pairs of sub-Saharan African populations, is far from negligible on the time scale of evolution. Selection on height and infant head circumference can occur within a couple of thousand years. Seems a bad bet to argue that there cannot be similar average differences in cognitive or behavioral traits. If we do not yet know what the real differences are, we should prepare our science and our society to be able to deal with the reality of differences instead of sticking our heads in the sand and pretending that differences cannot be discovered. All right, let's get back to Paul Gottfried.
I think the breakdown of policing power, this is going to go on because people are voting for Black Lives Matter and these other people. Even if they say, you know, intermittently they want police protection, you know, they don't. I mean, I look at how blacks vote in the United States. They say they want police protection, but they vote for people who are going to take away the police protection, even when they say that they want it. I just don't know whether we can survive the effects of mass democracy in this society or any other Western society.
Next question from Luke Avita, and it is this. There are two questions here, actually. I believe they're both for Paul. I know the first one definitely is, and I think the second one. Number one, Dr. Gottfried's thoughts on monarchy in general and the Habsburgs in particular. I have read elsewhere Paul describes himself as a Habsburg monarchist.
I am. You know, I mean, if it were possible to restore it, I would. I think Habsburg, Austria-Hungary after 1867 was probably the most civilized society that has ever existed. I have great respect for the imperial family. I doubt we can bring them back. And even if we did bring them back, they probably would be like, you know, the Swedish monarch or some people that any stripped of power being basically used to decorate postage stamps or dollar or whatever the currency is, the shilling, whatever, the euro, or whatever they're using there. So, you know, I think the changes are irreversible. And as a Schmittian, I would have to say, you know, eine geschichtliche Wahrheit ist nur einmal wahr, that an historical truth is true only once. We're not going to go back. I simply would like to halt this egalitarian madness and mass democracy, the effects of which we are dealing with today. And, you know, there are things in the past that I like. I like Platonic dialogues. I read classical Greek. And so, but I really don't, it is impossible to go back to these good things. They're lost. The question is what to do at this point in time.
And for the second question from Luke, any tips on studying history as an amateur? Is a practice of writing required to synthesize what you are learning?
Yeah. One of the things that I recommend to people, and I know this, is to read great historical works of the past, starting with Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars, which may have been the greatest historical work ever written. And, you know, I think there are great histories of the past which we should be reading. If you read German, you want to read Leopold von Ranke's Weltgeschichte, World History. They're great French histories. Something I strongly recommend is the work of Hustel de Coulanges in French. You read it in English on the ancient city. one of the things that he does is show the influence of Indo-European thought on the development of classical civilization. It's a brilliant work written in the 1850s. I think there's real value in going back and reading great historical works of the past. One contemporary work that I recommend to everyone, I think it's a work in English written by an Australian who's at Cambridge, is the book on World War I by Christopher Clark called Sleepwalkers. It's a brilliant study of how all the great countries of Europe, through oversights, through mistake, through hubris, wander or collapse into World War I. It is a brilliantly written work, which is also sort of shows the tragic consequences of bad statecraft and delusion that led to World War I.
And now for the next question from J.T. Tyler. What are, and this wasn't specified to anyone, which could be a little difficult to say the least.
Okay, let's get back to doing Nathan Kofnis's essay here on group differences. Section 2 explains why, from a scientific perspective, it is so difficult to determine the cause of group differences in intelligence, although the genetic origin of race differences can only be definitively established when the fields of genetics and neuroscience are unified in a way that will not happen for several years. Less definitive evidence that is currently available seems to implicate genes. Section 3 of my essay raises a question of values. Should science be absolutely committed to the truth, or some philosophers and scientists believe a topic such as race differences in intelligence just too dangerous to face openly? Section 4 argues that utilitarian considerations favor open inquiry into the cause of race differences. Section 5 argues that truth has value independent of its consequences, though this value should be balanced against the potential dangers of truth. Section 6 argues that philosophers should help devise an ethical way to respond to group differences in intelligence in anticipation of the possibility that they will be shown to exist.
But I would presume, for Paul, I'll just go with that. What are your thoughts about the talk of America being in a managed decline? What are your thoughts about China specifically? It's Made in China 2025 and Belt and Road Initiative. Thank you in advance for your time.
Thank you. Well, I think it's sort of hard to compare these societies. This is the same problem we had when Paul Robinson was talking about Russian conservatism, which you cannot compare to whatever American conservatism is, because they're not capitalists. In fact, they believe in state control of the economy. So you're sort of dealing with alternative universes. And I think to some extent, China and the United States represent alternative systems or universes. China has an enormous population with 1.5 billion people over there. They're rapidly industrializing. They pirate, they steal things from everybody, on the planet. And then occasionally someone like Donald Trump will come along and try to insist that they behave more fairly with us. But, they'll go on doing this until they're able to develop their country industrially. They'll probably, destroy the environment irreparably in the process. But they are a very poor country compared to us. They're a country with a large population. They're poor, low standard of living. But the cumulative effect of all those people working together, people who have pretty high intelligence too, is that they become an economic competitor to us. They also become a military competitor because they have enough military technology to become a major armed force, and they also have so many people in their military. They can draw on what do we draw on? 350 million. They can draw on 1.5 billion to create a military presence for themselves. So they are rivals, but they sort of, in a sense, were sort of incommensurable. The same was true with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was an enormous military threat to us. They had kind of international system of influence, or a network of influence with the Communist Party and all the communist dupes and my colleagues when I was an academic who would have done anything for the Soviets. They loved the communists. They really did. They were pro-communist. Many of them still are, although they've gone on to intersectional politics now. But the reality is that the Soviets were, almost a kind of third world economic power with a very large military. So we were not really roughly equivalent once you get beyond the military question. And I think the same thing is sort of true with China, that they are not the economic power that we are. However, they do have advantages. They buy our debts, right? They trade in American currency. They steal, our industrial secrets, our high tech, everything else. And a very, very large military force, which is now asserting its power right in the China Sea and elsewhere. And they also try to sell some of their industrial goods and develop close economic relations to countries in Africa and the Middle East. So even though they are not the economic powerhouse that we are in the United States, nor are they the cultural powerhouse. I mean, how many people outside of China read Chinese books? They are. In some areas, particularly in terms of military power, and one might say sort of their growing technological presence, I think they do represent the threat to the United States.
And the next question is from Big.
Okay, we've got a high school basketball coach who's been jumped by his own team.
A disturbing video tonight of some high school basketball players in New Jersey attacking their coach.
They're about to jump the basketball coach. They're about to jump the basketball coach. Oh!
Really disturbing. It happened Tuesday night after a basketball game at Malcolm X Shabazz High School in Newark. The assault now under investigation at the school.
The bigger question, why did this happen? New Jersey reporter Anthony Johnson live at the campus in Newark with the story. Anthony.
Well, the first thing we want to tell you is that all of the members of
I know why it happened. It's because Newark is run by Democrats, and Dems are the real racists.
The basketball team involved in this incident have now been suspended from the school, but this is certainly a black eye for the team here at Shabazz High.
About just the basketball coach.
This is another case where a few bad apples ruin it for the entire team. But
this is a truly shocking behavior. I would not have expected this kind of behavior at Shabazz High. Could you expect this kind of behavior at Shabazz High? I know I can't.
This video is troubling when a group of kids violently attacked the junior varsity basketball coach, and the incident is caught on cell phone. It's shared on social media throughout the entire student body, and most are disappointed by the behavior shown in the video.
It's kind of embarrassing that we're getting seen as this when we should be getting seen for better things like our community, our teens and stuff. This is like, ugh.
The incident Tuesday night happened after a basketball game in Livingston. According to sources, the coach tried to stop his players from picking on another student, but the bullies turned on the coach instead.
Yeah, it's just like fighting. Oh, she said this, he said this. Oh, why you do this? Why you did this to me? So it's just kind of crazy.
Newark Mayor Ras Baraka was at the school this morning talking to administrators, the team, and coaches, and followed his meeting by issuing a statement saying the actions of these students will not be tolerated, and they don't represent the majority of the school. The school and team have many great kids. Parents say the troublemakers should get what they deserve.
Until they get the parents that's going to put their foot down, it's going to continue happening.
Many students agree, saying the melee is shameful, but also admit there have been other similar incidents that have taken place after kids walk away from the school. And there was extra security at the school this afternoon.
Well, I just did not expect this kind of behavior at Shabazz High School, one of our finest institutions of learning. Just shocking behavior. Colin Liddell is joining us. Colin, what are your thoughts on Katie McHugh and the ongoing doxers that she is generating?
Yeah, it's become a cottage industry for her, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, what else can she do, really? She probably can't get a job, or a good job, or any kind of job, maybe. And every now and then, these various sites pop up and squeeze that lemon a little bit more.
And do you have any thoughts on the Irish election? It seems like 3 different parties of about 22% of the vote. I don't know if you've been following it at all.
Well, is it really important who wins the Irish election? Because I mean, Brussels will just tell them what to do, So, and they'll just have to be grateful.
What would you say are the biggest differences between, say, the Irish and the English in personality or organization behavior?
Well, there's enormous differences, really. I mean, most of the distinguished people in Ireland had some sort of Anglo element, I've noticed, or actually quite often a Scottish element. Jameson whiskey, that's a Scottish family originally. The they talk about Swift as a great Irish writer. Everybody knows he's English, even though he lived in Dublin. So most of these, the Duke of Wellington is another example, born in Ireland, but basically very, very Anglo. So Ireland's been this rather strange, unusual country on the edge of, on the edge of Britain or the Anglo world. And in certain ways, it's similar to Wales and parts of Scotland. There is a kind of very distinct difference between the people, and the Irish they seem to be I guess the word would be very Celtic, very mystical people, kind of quite poetic, but not always kind of logical and rational, and not really able to build high-functioning societies to the same extent as the more Germanic populations that took over most of the island of Britain, and then later moved on in some degree to Ireland. So there's an element of Anglo-Irish history which sets a template for the British Empire and Britain's big effort to go out and colonize and settle other countries or more backward lands.
So just within Ireland, I'm trying to think of Anglo versus Catholic differences, which are really a shorthand for, I would assume, some genetic differences. It seems like Irish Catholics tend to be much more socialist or even communist, and Anglos, the orientation is more individualist and free market. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, but I think what you're looking at there is a kind of rural versus urban culture, and Ireland is much more rural culture, more tied to the land, small farms. That's the kind of Irish ideal, and the cities were kind of imposed on them. I mean, most of the Irish cities were actually set up by the Vikings. Cities like Cork and Dublin, of course, and practically every big Irish city, Limerick, these places were all started by the Vikings, and so I think that is the essential difference: rural versus urban.
I know that in Australia, all of its unions were essentially taken over by the communists, who are largely Irish in their origins. So it does seem there's a strong like social impulse to the Irish orientation as opposed to the much more individualistic Anglo orientation.
Well, probably what you're seeing there is actually, it's not you're viewing it in geopolitical economic terms, but really what's going on is a kind of clannishness. People from less developed areas, whether it's mountainous regions like Albania or the Caucasus, or it's these remote kind of Irish areas, and places like the kind of Gaelic-speaking parts of Scotland. People tend to be very clannish, and then that kind of expresses itself in the case that you're talking about. Irish people going to, actually being sent to Australia. Let's be honest about that. All expenses paid by Her Majesty's government, and you get this Irish population, and they carry with them that kind of clannish thing. We've got to stick together, and we've got to look for some way we can work things out to our advantage. And so trade unions are a good way of doing that, and leftist politics is another good way of doing that. And forming groups like Sinn Féin and the IRA is yet another way of doing that. So these are the kind of expressions of tribalism, which Anglo people might not really fully understand because it's not really something that's inherent to them. Being from Scotland, you get a bit of a sense of that. Even if you're not that embedded in that kind of tribalism.
Now, I come from Australia, where there's something called the tall poppy syndrome, which means anyone who excels tends to get mocked, as opposed to, say, Anglo-America, where people who are excelled get, generally speaking, venerated. What is the Irish attitude, or say the Irish Catholic attitude, towards individuals who excel?
I'm not really sure about that. But I suspect that like in these villages, the kind of village mentality, you don't like to see people get too ahead of themselves, and so you've got to kind of like keep it on the down low, not rub it in people's faces too much. So yeah, I think there is a kind of petty democratization effect that comes from living in a kind of rural area. And of course, in Ireland, that's probably kind of even heightened or strengthened by the fact that a lot of the land owners used to be a sort of alien Anglo race.
And what are the cliches for differences in between the Welsh, the Scots, and the English? What are the cliches for those different groups?
I can't go into that. They're all racist, those cliches. You know, Scottish people are tight-fisted and a bit dour. Irish people, they like to have a drink, and they get into pointless fights with people. And the English are a bit effete and, can't really do their own dirty work.
What about the Welsh? What are the stereotypes about the Welsh?
Most of the stereotypes about the Welsh seem to center on their predilection for sexual relations across the species barrier.
Aha.
Which are very unkind and completely unwarranted. And, but they're also, the Welsh are kind of musical people. You know, they're the choirs, the choral singing, and of course they're famous for the rugby. So yeah, the Welsh are kind of funny people. They often look quite differently. There's a kind of darkness to the Welsh that people often comment on. I mean, you look at somebody like Tom Jones, for example, and you see why he had such a kind of soulful voice.
Now, what is it about like English women? They are frequently gorgeous, like peaches and cream complexion. Is that just anecdotal, or do Anglo-English women have a disproportionate amount of beauty?
You're talking about the cliche of the English rose.
Yeah, I mean, but when I rode the subway, or whatever you call the subway in London, I was stunned by all the stunning, Anglo-English chicks.
Are you sure they're from England?
Well, they were all immersed in like the Church of England prayer book, so I just assumed.
Yeah, I saw a very nice English girl on the internet just today. This is this video. I don't know if you've seen it. I mean, it's going the rounds. It's one of these viral things. This this pretty English rose was on holiday in the Maldive Islands. Does that ring any bell?
No, but I'm going to do some English Maldives.
And she was wearing a bikini in the wrong parts of town. And there was somebody managed to film the police awkwardly arresting her, and she was really kind of empowered. She was like, what the fuck are you doing? I'm a white woman. How dare you? All this kind of thing. And eventually they managed to put the cuffs on her, and she was arrested for an hour and a half, and then let go, and then she flew out of the country after that. But the thing was, when I looked into the story a little bit further, she's a very nice girl and all that, but I looked into the story, and she had one of these Eastern European names, like a lot of pretty girls often have, even though her pronunciation was quite English sounding.
And where are the Maldives? Are they off of Africa?
Well, they're somewhere in the Indian Ocean. I think it's that's the country that's always supposed to be sinking due to global warming. It's a very popular place for diving and the like,
What do you think about the work of Paul Kersey, and how do you think he's going to react to this extensive doxing?
Well, yeah, Paul Kersey. Yeah, I mean, I got one of his books a long time ago. One of these, I forget which one it was, and it was pretty boring. To be perfectly honest, it's pretty much the same thing again and again and again. You know, retelling the same basic idea. It's sort of like hammering in the nail after it's been hammered in. You know, that's basically Paul Kersey. It's just been on. We all know that there's a lot of black on white crime. That cities that have large percentages of black people don't do well, and you know the people are all in denial about race in America, and so you're not allowed to talk about it. And so, you know, all these narratives, these very basic narratives, are very well established and really done to death, I think, now. He also did some more kind of normie work for what was it?
WorldNet Daily.
Yeah, WND, WorldNet Daily, and I did listen to some of his podcasts that he did with Jared Taylor, the American Renaissance, and they weren't too bad. I mean, he's not a stupid guy, but I just think his writing is pretty monochrome, let's say.
Right. Anything you've noticed going on in English politics that's caught your attention over the past couple of weeks?
Oh, well, the SNP, the SNP have had a little bit of trouble. They've got their former leader, Alex Salmond. He's currently on trial for rape, amongst other crimes and misdemeanors. And then the politician who was tipped to step into Nicola Sturgeon's shoes, this guy, I think he's about 42-year-old guy called Mackay. He was the kind of financial minister and the rising star of the party. And it turns out looks like he's been grooming a young lad on social media. And so he's had to step down. That's his career in the can. So yeah, it's pretty funny. What's the SNP have kind of like reached the end of the road because they're not going to be able to get their second referendum. Boris Johnson is not going to fall for that one. And even if they did get a second referendum, I don't think it would really go any differently than the first one. And by the time, assuming they manage to keep the pressure on for the next 5 to 10 years, even if they do get another referendum, by then Brexit will be done and dusted, and people will be a lot less willing to vote for independence because of the uncertainty factor that it would create. So I really think they're running out of road. And the other thing about the SNP is it's not really that S, if you know what I mean. It's not very Scottish.
Yeah, the SNP is the Scottish National Party, in case people don't know. Okay, Colin, back to you.
Yeah, it's not very Scottish. There are Scottish people in it, but a lot of the people turn out to be crypto-Irish. That is, they're Scottish people who have roots elsewhere, like in Ireland, in Catholic Ireland normally. And their Scottish nationalism is more an expression, not of the logic of the situation, but it's more of a kind of expression, that kind of ancestral dislike of the English as the cruel oppressors of noble Hibernia.
And what's your understanding of Jordan Peterson's situation?
I believe he became addicted to a prescription drug, and when he's, I think this drug was to kind of calm him down because he's obviously, quite a excitable person in some ways, and he basically became very dependent on this drug, and it was having all sorts of bad effects on him, and he was taking too much of it, it seems like, and apparently the doctors were allowing this to continue, and so. And now he seems to have taken some more radical action by going off to Russia to have some kind of cold turkey detoxing in Russia, which is probably the best thing.
He has a very fetching daughter. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, he was also in an induced coma, and this is all coming from his daughter, who released a video quite recently.
Lingerie.
Well, she probably had the heating turned up when she made. I don't know. Anyway, so it does look a bit. Yeah, that struck a slightly unusual note. But yeah, it's a pretty funny. Funny as in unusual. It's nothing to laugh about what's happening to Jordan Peterson. So I think Stefan Molyneux did a video where he was putting on as if Jordan Peterson was at death's door. So yeah, we wish him the best. Get well soon, Dr. Peterson.
Does this? How do we understand Dr. Peterson's teachings in the light of this ordeal? Does it affect anything?
Well, it definitely does, because the thing that people hold against him is he's basically a kind of liberal individualist who emphasizes that, don't get involved in group-oriented politics. That's not important. You've got to do the kind of self-improvement, focus on the things around you that you personally can control. And then he goes and does this. It basically invalidates his whole philosophy.
How much attention have you paid to him over the years?
And not very much, to be honest. Most of the things that he says boil down to basic common sense.
Now, the coronavirus, I was reading an article on VDare which pointed out that of the approximately 700 people who've died from the coronavirus, every single one is racially Chinese, which is not the story that we're getting from the news media. So certainly there have been Americans who've died from, or I don't know, they're citizens of other countries who've died from the coronavirus, but they always turn out to be Chinese racially. So perhaps race is real, and that different races have different susceptibilities to the coronavirus. Is there anything in the coronavirus story that you found interesting?
Well, this is what we're all waiting to find out. It does seem to, so far. I mean, it's early days, and it did start in China, so it would be logical that most people affected would be Chinese. But we're all waiting to find out, is this yet more proof that racial differences do exist? But it's not necessarily, it might not even just be a racial difference. I think one of the things that, this is not the first of these new viruses to come out of China. They all seem to be centered in China. SARS was Chinese, MERS is Chinese, and now this new coronavirus is Chinese. It's very much a Chinese thing, and it's not. The other thing is like the timing. Why are we suddenly getting a lot of these new viruses centered in China within the last couple of decades? And the obvious answer is that Chinese people's living standards have changed greatly. And I think this change in living standards is actually creating the conditions for these viruses to emerge. And, the one thing about the Chinese is that, China's been one of the most overpopulated and thus one of the poorest countries in the world for as long as anybody can remember. The vast majority of the population were living at a very, very low subsistence rate. They would be eating mainly vegetables, hardly any meat. There would be very little in the way of livestock. If there were livestock, they would be being reared for the very tiny rich elite. So Chinese people were not really acclimatized to a kind of high livestock breeding, meat eating situation. And now that China's made all these enormous leaps and bounds economically, the Chinese people's living standard has soared, and so Chinese people's diet has completely changed. And you see the same thing in Japan, but the Japanese have done this a lot sooner, and that's had an enormous influence on these groups. I mean, when the Americans and the British turned up in Japan, the Japanese were a tiny race of people. They're very, very short. And then when Japan managed to modernize and introduce a lot of Western innovations like milk and meat on a regular basis, the population started to shoot up. And you see signs of this all over Japan. Like you see these little doorways, and you think, why would anybody build a doorway that low, and so on. And tall people like myself, I'm obviously a giant. We're always having to worry about bumping our heads all over the place.
So go ahead, keep going.
Yeah, so I'm just saying that this change in diet and the conditions that go with it, like if Chinese people are eating a lot of meat, there's a lot more livestock, and these various kinds of viruses, they exist in connection with animals. And now Western European people, we have we've lived among animals much longer. I mean, in Scotland, people used to basically bring the animals into the house for winter in the old days. Half the house would be the people, the other half would be the animals, bedded down for the winter. And so people have lived cheek by jowl with animals in Western culture much more than they have in East Asian culture. And so we are much more acclimatized to any kind of pest or parasite or virus that might also be dependent on animals.
Sorry.
So I think that might be at the root of it. Our greater exposure to livestock in over the ages in history gives us a much stronger natural resistance to these kinds of animal-borne viruses. But that remains to be seen. But hopefully that is part of the picture, because that would also help to contain and slow down the virus.
Now, I'm concerned that this coronavirus may give rise to anti-Chinese sentiments in Japan. Have you noticed that happening?
Well, you don't have to give rise to anti-Chinese sentiments in Japan. They're basically, baked into the cake, So, but in a kind of nice way.
Yeah. How
reasonably polite dislike. I mean, most Japanese people will be a little bit, standoffish when it comes to the Chinese. They've had a lot of Chinese visitors in recent years, and there's been hordes of Chinese. The Chinese love coming to Japan, and in central Tokyo, you see vast tour groups, and they're all their manners are not exactly to the liking of the Japanese, I have to say. And they do tend to be a lot more voluble than the Japanese when they speak, which doesn't go down too well either. But again, there's a lot of economic interaction. There's much more economic interaction between Japan and China now than there is between Japan and America. And Japan is a bit concerned about what this might do to the Olympic Games as well. So. There's talk in some quarters of the Olympic Games being cancelled, which would be a terrible tragedy. Wow. Because we wouldn't be able to see water polo games.
How far are we away from the Olympics?
I'm not. They're holding it in the middle of summer, at the worst possible time. I think it's going to be in July and August. I think, off the top of my head. So it's the worst possible time. It's it's a terrible time to run a marathon. So I think the Japanese are doing it on purpose, because they figure that they might have a slightly better chance of winning either the ladies or the men's marathon if they hold the event during the most hot and humid time of the year, because that might have some adverse effect on the Ethiopians and the other East Africans, because they're used to a much drier kind of hot climate. So we'll see.
And what are the main news stories in Japan right now? Is it the coronavirus and its possible effect on the Olympics?
Yeah, I would say that would be the more or less the main one, and then some other trivial rubbish which nobody else is interested in.
Is Japan's government stable? Does the leader and his governing party have a pretty solid majority?
Well, everybody hates the government, but it's very, very stable. So there, that's Japanese politics in a nutshell. It's a bit like people in Japan, they view politics with a certain kind of distaste. It's a bit like something that there's a kind of untouchable class who do the dirty job, and that's how they view politicians. And so they're not viewed with much affection or respect. But somebody has to be the politicians, and so Abe and his gang. Oh yeah, let them get on with it,
And how much attention do the Japanese pay to their royal family?
Well, surprisingly little compared to people in Britain. You hardly notice the Japanese royal family most weeks or months. They just, occasionally there's a little thing they do, and you might see a little story on the TV, and it's all very nice, and there's no scandals, and there are some parts of the media that focus on them more, and there are some sort of scandal sheets that focus on some of the kind of trivia, but not so that you'd notice unless you went looking for it.
I'm looking at a news story. Sorry, keep going.
No, it's not like in Britain where you can't escape from like Meghan this and Meghan that and Harry and Meghan and all this shit, and Mexit, and we had Mexit in the UK, but the British news is still inundated with stories about Harry and Meghan. I mean, this recent thing, I think they flew off to they're very woke and green issues. They got a private jet from Vancouver Island all the way down to Florida, and they did some speaking gig for J.P. Morgan, and so that was all over the British news. So you couldn't get away from that, and everybody was commenting on it and arguing about it. So really, very different from the Japanese, where the royal family is allowed to kind of exist in semi-obscurity.
What does Japan have a thriving tabloid press, and if so, what composes content for Japan's tabloid press?
Well, a lot of the there is some quite shocking. For Western people, tabloid press in Japan. A lot, you'll see people on the trains reading very sleazy tabloid papers, which are full of pornographic imagery, and they'll do this quite openly, and so it's kind of funny the way that they don't really feel. I mean, like we'd feel a bit embarrassed reading stuff like that on the train, and everybody looking at us and knowing what we were reading. But in Japan, not so much.
Are there still geishas in Japan, and what do they do?
Yeah, of course. You know that there's geishas. I often tease Japanese people about geishas being prostitutes, and surprising how often that when you do that, ordinary Japanese people will leap to the defense of geishas and emphasize their cultural role as musicians and so on.
Interesting. What are your favorite parts about living in Japan?
I think we've probably talked about that before on this show. Maybe we could encourage people to go back and have a listen to earlier shows.
Okay. So what are you reading these days?
Let's see. What am I reading? Yeah, good question. Hang on, I'm just gonna get my my reading pile.
They're talking to Colin Liddell here. Got a couple of websites, Trad News and Affirmative Right. He's also got a book out there. Colin Liddell, Liddell.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay, got a few books here. Top of the pile, the one that I'm going through at the moment is Loyalists by Peter Taylor, who's also the author of Provos. So it's about the Loyalist paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland. So it's it's pretty detailed. He spoke to a lot of people, and he's talking about how the Troubles got started from looking at it from the Loyalist perspective. His previous book, I haven't read that, but I assume it did the opposite from the kind of Catholic Irish point of view.
Oh, interesting. And I'm looking at a news story here. It says the Japanese passport is the most powerful passport in the world. It's accepted by the most countries without need for a visa. Apparently, out of the world's 199 countries, Japanese passport holders can enter 191 countries without a visa. Singapore, with 190 countries, came second, followed by South Korea and Germany at 189. Afghanistan is apparently the weakest passport. It gives you visa-free access to only 26 countries. So I assume this means that most countries see no reason to be concerned about Japanese visitors.
Yeah, that's what it means. It just means, those people from those countries who travel are pretty guaranteed to behave themselves and cause very few problems. I think most people would agree with that.
So how does American politics look from Japan? We had the Democrats an absolute fiasco in Iowa, but it does seem that Mayor Pete is rising. Seems like it's going to come down to a battle between Mayor Pete and Bernie Sanders. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I've noticed that, they've kind of run out of options, really. Basically, the Dems are, this is not a Japanese analysis, it's just my own analysis. I don't really watch the Japanese analysis of American politics because it's very boring. But yeah, this is what's happened is the Dems have got a whole slate of really crap candidates. Biden's too old and semi-senile, and Sanders is not a bad candidate in some ways, but he's very problematic for the Dems. They can't really get behind him, so they're trying to. It's like last time with Hillary. They're doing everything they can to sabotage him because basically they, for two reasons. First of all, they think that he won't be accepted by the kind of the voters and by independent voters especially. And the other thing is, even if he could be accepted by the voters, they would be very worried about him being the president because he doesn't subscribe to all the things that they expect a candidate to subscribe to. So I think there's nobody else, and so everything's kind of like this guy's Buttigieg. He's basically got nothing. He's just, all we know about him is he's a mayor of a small town and he's gay and he was in the army. Okay, so what? And this is all that people know about him. And maybe he's semi competent at communicating. He's and because they've got absolutely nobody else, because everybody else is a glaring monstrosity. Gradually, they've started to focus more and more on this guy. So they were hoping that they were hoping that Biden could still do it, but that's become more and more obvious that he can't. And they were also hoping that maybe Warren could step up, and she might have a, the spotlight might give her a little spark of charisma or something. But no, that obviously wasn't going to happen. And the more people see of her, the less they like her, and the more they see of Biden now at his advanced stage, where he's kind of like gibbering away and looking completely senile, the less they like him as well. And so who else have they got? I mean, I was hoping they might focus more on Tulsi or even Yang, but obviously that's not going to happen. They haven't hit the threshold where they can be even considered. And this little guy, this Pete Buttigieg guy, he's managed to get over the threshold where he's actually in the run-in. And with the other big names in the run-in, they're all monstrosities by comparison. So I think they're going to go to him more and more. And he's got. I think in American politics, every candidate has to have some kind of exciting story. And with Obama, there was an obvious story there. The first black guy to run for president in a big way, and so that kind of helped propel him, that narrative. And with Trump, there was a very strong narrative as well. And so he's got that kind of narrative that he's gay, and that's actually a selling point in getting the publicity in the media and everything, even though when the media focus on him, there's not really much there. He's kind of quite a boring non-entity. But he could very well end up as the Democratic candidate, and then it becomes a question of how woke is average small town America? Are they really going to vote for a gay guy with a first husband? It's just such a kind of. I mean, people like to signal that they are tolerant of gays, but that's usually just to kind of like get away from them, because like with the gay marriage thing, people thought, okay, if we just let them have it, they'll just calm down and we won't hear so much from them. It was a way of getting rid of them. Gay tolerance is a way of getting rid of gays. You don't want to have them in front of you all the time making a fuss about how gay they are. And if Buttigieg is the candidate, it's going to be very hard to escape from that. And it's all going to be about how much gay acceptance is there in America. And I think when you get down to it, I think there's not really that much. People want to be nice. They want to say nice things and be well thought of, and they don't want to be seen as homophobic and all that. But also, they don't want to have the president kissing the first husband on the stairs of the White House.
And could a homosexual be elected prime minister in Japan?
I doubt it.
Do they have same-sex marriage in Japan?
Not really. No. I mean, there are people who are trying to, push that thing, but the great Japanese public are very kind of. They have a lot of inertia, let's say. They're not really fired up by these issues.
Michael Bloomberg, how viable a candidate do you think he is?
No, I mean, he's too short. Let's face it. I mean, I don't think the Americans are going to vote in a short guy. I think they'll probably be even, less tolerant of a short person than a gay person.
Okay, what about a Jew? Between voting for a Jew who used to sound like a communist and a nice gay guy like Mayor Pete, who do you think's got a better shot at getting the average American's vote, all things else being equal?
Well, Mayor Pete's got a better chance. Yeah, I mean, Bernie. I mean, a lot of people in the alt-right. This is how retarded the alt-right is now. They're all, they're all supporting Bernie, and they're all anti-Trump, and Trump is so evil, and all this is pathetic. But the problem with a Jew being elected president of America is that the president, whoever he is, attracts a lot of heat, as we've seen with Trump, and before that with Obama, and before that with Bush, and before that with everybody. So having a Jewish president, it would be kind of interesting. I mean, if you think about it, maybe the alt-right, because the alt-right is essentially it's essentially a political movement that is dominated by the Pano theory of the Jews are responsible for all the evil in the world and in America. And so if you had a Jewish president in Bernie Sanders, if somehow he managed to win the nomination, and then somehow he managed to be elected, if you had a Jewish president in America, that would be very interesting. It'd serve as a kind of catalyst for more and more anti-Semitism in a way, because people would blame everything that went wrong on Bernie Sanders, and the fact that he was Jewish, and the fact that there's other nefarious Jews. And so you could see how that might kick into a kind of anti-Semitism or counter-Semitism dynamic. And then, if you consider...
have you been to...
Another night. Because, I've got to be going pretty soon.
Okay. How long have you lived in Japan?
Oh, I've lost count, to be honest. Pretty long.
20 years? Approximately?
Something, sort of ballparkish, yeah.
What would you say are the biggest cultural differences that you've seen in those years? How have the Japanese changed from your outsider perspective?
Again, that's a big question, because you start to kind of come to any conclusion on that. You have to start raking through your memories of various events and people and situations, and so it's kind of pretty hard to answer that.
Oh, let me just ask one final specific question. What about cell phone use in America? And I assume in England, a lot of people are really rude. They're yelling on their cell phones in public. They're talking on their phones while driving. Cell phones have become a hugely disruptive and unpleasant part of life in the West. How about in Japan?
Oh, cell phones, yeah. I mean, you get on the train and everybody's looking at their cell phone, but they're not speaking on it. They're using their smartphones to access the internet, check their messages and things like that, but very, very quietly. So it kind of fills that kind of micro time on the trains. Before they would be reading books and these pornographic newspapers that I mentioned earlier. But you see a lot less of that now, because people are reading quietly their cell phones as they go backwards and forwards to work and their homes.
One final question. How many Japanese dressed in a traditional Japanese distinctive way?
A minority, probably less than 1%. I mean, you when they do it, it stands out, and so you kind of like over register it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd say it's very, very few. Sometimes you get young people doing it, and then there's certain occasions like the coming of age ceremony, which was quite recent. When people come of age in Japan when they're 20, they normally, especially ladies, they dress up in a kimono. They go to the I can't remember, is it the shrine or the temple, one of the two, and they also go to the municipal office to get their adult certificate, or I guess, and so they'll sometimes dress up in traditional garb for those kinds of occasions, and probably weddings too. Some people, maybe funerals, but generally speaking, you don't really see people wearing traditional garb.
Is there any book that you would recommend for understanding the Japanese?
Sorry, I haven't written it yet, so after you get cracking.
Okay, Colin, great to talk to you. Any final words of wisdom?
No, just keep doing what you're doing, Luke.
Thanks, Colin. Thank you very much.
Right, cheers, bye.
Cheers. Cheers, mate. Good to talk to you. Okay, let's go back here to Paul Gottfried, speaking with Joseph Cotter.
Pingu, interesting username. I countries that, while not declaring war against the U.S., are doing things that are not friendly toward it. So yeah, I think a modified isolationist policy would be my perspective. But one must emphasize the word modified. I don't want that to be taken out of context. Paul, what's your point of view here?
Yeah, I agree with what Joseph has said about, a kind of modified isolationism, and that would be, my choice if it were possible. What does concern me, however, is that the United States sees itself as an ideological power. As I compare it, let's say, to Spain, Catholic Spain in the 16th century, or to the Soviet Union, that we exist to push certain things that are defined as human rights, most recently the right of gays to have parades and to have marriage or something like that, or feminist rights. So in a country which is not part of a traditional nation-state system of the kind that Carl Schmitt envisaged, but which is really an imperial power with tremendous cultural influence, in which there is a kind of public creed, post-Christian public creed of global democracy, human rights, women's rights, gay rights, transgendered restrooms, and whatever, it is very hard to see how that can be separated from the conduct of foreign policy. And it's very hard to do. I remember when Henry Kissinger would say, well, my foreign policy is based on realism, but I don't want to separate morality. Well, my question is, what do you mean by morality? And morality is somebody's laundry list of human rights, which may in fact not be my view of morality, but is what people in the State Department or the New York Times want. I think it's very hard to separate that what I would say idiosyncratic notion of morality from the conduct of foreign policy, and from the conduct of, I think Joseph and I would both argue for as modified isolationism.
And the two questions are from David Huval, and they're both for Paul, and they're both pretty intense. So, for Paul, the dissident right seems to be split into two factions on the question of America. Some, such as the populists and maybe some paleoconservatives, seem to be interested in trying to redeem and reclaim America. More hardcore alt-right figures tend to see America as a mistake from the start, with its emphasis on equality rather than hierarchy, and as such, they seem to welcome the coming of post-American politics. Where does Paul weigh in on these two ways of looking at America?
Well, first let me say, I don't think the United States was a mistake from the beginning. I have profound respect for the founders of the United States, and I have profound respect for the early American Republic. I just do not like what the United States has become in my own lifetime. I think the problem that this listener or commentator has examined is actually a bit more complex than he suggests, because I think the same paleoconservatives vacillate between these two positions. That it's all a mistake and it's terrible. We have no hierarchy, or else this is our country. We're going to have to make it better. And I think the same people, depending on what time of the day you're speaking to them, may in fact believe in both these positions. That's been my experience. And I do not deplore the founding of the United States, and I do not deplore the fact that it's a constitutional republic. It was founded that way. That's fine. I simply deplore what it has become in my own lifetime, and because of mistakes that I think that go back even to an earlier point before I was around. But I'd be very happy if it were possible to restore an older America. I just don't see how it can be done. I should say that I'm not against hierarchy. I think where it still exists in our society, I'm all in favor of keeping it. I mean, this does not refer to the deep state. This does not refer to leftist, yuppie elitists. I want to give them take all their power away from them. But if people live in a traditional society, a black Southern Baptist, and they listen to their minister or something, that's fine. I think that's great. I'm all in favor of maintaining traditional social order. I'm in favor of patriarchy. If it, wherever it exists, in some small corner of Arkansas or someplace else, I'd like to keep it. I'm very critical of egalitarianism. I just have no idea how we are going to restore, traditional social order. I think this is the problem. I think it may be irreversibly lost, and I think the modern managerial therapeutic state, the media, the miseducators in universities and so forth have pretty much destroyed the faith in traditional social institutions.
Also for Paul, Is it accurate to see H.L. Mencken as a paleoconservative thinker? And what does Paul make of Mencken's interest in Nietzsche, as Nietzsche is often linked to the more extreme wing of dissident right politics in America?
Yeah, I don't know what I would call him. I suppose he would, if he were around today, he'd be a paleoconservative. I have no doubt about that. I think he's an extremely gifted writer. I think he's a brilliant writer, a satirist of a certain kind who sort of takes no prisoners and makes fun of democracy. And I think a lot of the things that he criticizes deserve to be criticized. He was an isolationist in both world wars. I think the Second World War, at least our efforts to stop the Nazis in Europe were certainly justified. I don't think he saw it that way. But I think that's because he properly understood that America's involvement in World War I was a catastrophic mistake, which I think it was. I think the countries of Europe would have reached a peace by the end of 1917 had the United States not intervened on one side against the other. The best way the war could have ended was in a negotiated peace. The Treaty of Versailles was led inevitably to another war. I don't see how it could have, because it so humiliated the defeated side. So I think Mencken was absolutely right about that. He's also criticized as a Germanophile, and I must say culturally I'm a Germanophile. I like speaking German. I like German literature and music and philosophy and so forth. I don't think Mencken's tastes were any different from mine. I don't drink much beer. I suppose he was a heavy beer drinker. But, you know, I still enjoy reading him. I think some of his writing is dated. But, you know, other things that he wrote, I think are certainly worth reading, particularly his caustic remarks about mass democracy.
And the next three questions are from Dylan Williams, and they are for Paul, of course. Number one, how would you describe your religious belief, and to what extent do you think a belief in God is necessary for a coherent foundation of ethics? This will have to be a nutshell answer, to say the least.
I know. I cannot give a 3-hour theological discourse. As I said, I do believe in God. I believe in biblical morality. I can't say I'm not a biblical literalist, but, you know, I think the moral social truths of the Bible remain true. They are the basis of what seemed to me any kind of civilized social order. On theological questions, it would probably be to carry us too far afield if I were to give you a discussion of of my metaphysical propositions. So,
okay, let's go back to the Forkoffness. This is section 2 of his essay on group differences in intelligence. Section 2, the scientific controversy. The mere fact that populations differ in IQ tells us little or nothing about the source of the difference. The difference could be due to genes, but it could also be due to some environmental factors such as education, nutrition, cultural bias in IQ tests, and so on. How can we disentangle the effects of genes and environment? Behavioral geneticists have two principal methods for probing the roles of genes in phenotypic. That's the demonstration of the gene phenotypic differences. A, behavioral genetic studies on adoptees and twins, and B, genome-wide association studies. So what genetic clusters go with what associations? The heritability of a trait, the proportion of the variance in a population explained by genetic differences, can be determined by adoption and twin studies. If adopted children grow up to resemble their biological rather than their adoptive parents, this implicates genes. If genetically identical monozygotic twins raised together grow up to resemble each other more than genetically related but non-identical dizygotic twins raised together, this too implicates genes on certain testable assumptions such as equal environments, or in the case of adoption studies, random placement into adoptive environments. Adoption and twin studies showed that in the contemporary United States, the heritability of IQ in adulthood is around 60 to 80%. Even if IQ has high heritability within racial groups, this does not imply that race differences are genetic. You cannot infer between group heritability from within group heritability. Heritability studies cannot show definitively that race differences in intelligence have a genetic cause. It is always possible there is some hidden environmental factor.
Perhaps it might be best to go on to something else.
Well, there is something else. As a scholar of European history, what are some negative misconceptions you think people on the right might have about pre-World War I European monarchies?
Yeah, I find that most members of the old right, when they talk about pre-World War I Europe, usually talk very sensibly. The problem is that the conservative movement, what's called the conservative movement, I call Conservatism Incorporated, talks what used to be left as nonsense. They seem to hate most of the continental powers, which they see as reactionary, anti-Semitic, racist, whatever negative attributes they want to attach to it, and they seem to be hysterically anti-German. One of the things that I've argued about is that the German Empire, the Second Empire, in the late 19th, early 20th century, really was a constitutional monarchy, although it did not.
Okay, what's going on with Uncle Joe Biden? Let's see what's going on with Joe.
Hi, my name is Madison, and I'm an econ student at Mercer University. And oh, awesome! So I'm gonna be a little. Okay. So. So you're arguably the candidate with the greatest advantage in this race. You've been the vice president, weren't burdened down by the impeachment trials. So, in the participation. So how do you explain the performance in Iowa, and why should the voters believe that you can win the national election?
It's a good question. Number one, Iowa's a Democratic caucus. You ever been to a caucus? No, you haven't. You're a lying dog-faced pony soldier. You said you were, but now you got to be honest. I'm going to be honest with you. It was a...
Wow. Lying dog-faced pony soldier. That's interesting. So Joe Biden is really bringing it there out on the trail, bringing his A game. Right back to Coughness. Nevertheless, the high within-group heritability of IQ can be part of a package of evidence for between-group heritability. Point was made by Jensen in 1969, who was widely misunderstood, naively inferring from within-group heritability. Expounding on Jensen's argument, James Flynn writes that the probability of a genetic hypothesis will be much enhanced if, in addition to evidencing high heritability estimates, we find we can falsify literally every plausible environmental hypothesis, one by one. The obvious candidate X factor could explain race differences is, of course, racism. If racism lowers IQ, this could explain why the mean is shifted downwards for victimized groups. However, as James Flynn argues, attributing differences to racism, simply an escape from hard thinking and hard research. Racism is not some magic force that operates without a chain of causality. Racism harms people because of its effects, and when we list those effects, lack of confidence, low self-image, emasculation of the male, the welfare mother, home poverty, it seems absurd to claim that any one of them does not vary significantly within both black and white America. Now, after decades of intensive searching, the X factor remains elusive. Back to Paul Gottfried.
Had not yet evolved, one might say, as far in the direction of parliamentary control as you find in England. It was certainly not a precursor of the Third Reich or a proto-Nazi regime. It was no more responsible for World War I than France or certainly Russia, which I think was perhaps the most responsible, or England, which would certainly act to incite conflict on the continent and became sort of actively involved in encouraging one alliance system against the other. So, I don't think the problem is at all with the...
So let's look at some of Joe Biden's favorite insults so far to voters. Look, fat, or you got to go vote for someone else, or I'm beginning to see why your wife left you.
Old right or paleo conservatives. I think the misconceptions and in some cases the hardened prejudices reside entirely among neoconservatives and those whom they influence on what today, in some Pickwickian sense, is described as the American right.
And for the third question, what's your opinion on Oswald Spengler's theory of history from the decline of the West? And are we due for the rise of Caesarism as society further polarizes?
Yeah, let me say that I am profoundly...
So, great tweet here. This is coronavirus. It's deadlier than Ebola with an AR-47 and twice as racist. Why don't you care?
Really impressed by the writings of Spengler, particularly by his erudition and his prose. Der Untergang des Abendlandes, and some of his other writings like Preußentum und Sozialismus, Die Jahre der Entscheidung, other writings of his are absolutely brilliant. I mean, the insight that I see. By the way, he was a trained mathematician.
And Edward Dutton tweets, the last time Sinn Féin got the most votes in an Irish general election, there was a civil war. Just thought that I should mention that.
Who wrote in brilliant German prose and could write on literature and classics and just about anything else. I do not, however, buy his theory of what is a comparative morphology. I don't think all civilizations go through the same life cycles. I think they are very different. I don't think what's happening in the Western world is a repetition of what happened to the Roman Empire. I think there are profound differences, and there are different reasons for decline. I say this as somebody who admires much of what he writes about, the course of Western civilization, the difference between culture and civilization, the desiccation of traditional cultural values in advanced civilizations. A lot of this is brilliant. I just don't buy the overall theory and the comparison to comparative biological morphology. The rest of it is brilliant. I just don't buy, the overall.
Okay, what's going on with Bernie Sanders? Let's take a look. One of the best attacks on Bernie in the last few years came from Think Progress, pointing out he had stopped criticizing millionaires after he became one. Turns out railing against millionaires and billionaires can be quite the lucrative enterprise.
If I'm a millionaire,
or millionaires and billionaires.
For billionaires and millionaires.
For millionaires and billionaires.
A proliferation of millionaires and billionaires. When millionaires and billionaires of millionaires and billionaires.
Millionaires and billionaires. Millionaires and billionaires.
Millionaires and billionaires. Millionaires and billionaires.
Millionaires and billionaires.
Millionaires and billionaires. This is a budget of the billionaire class, by the billionaire class, and for the billionaire class. More billionaires in his administration.
Billionaires. Billionaires and the wealthiest people.
Billionaires and the wealthy. A handful of billionaires and other billionaires.
Billionaires.
Allow billionaires, multi-millionaires, and billionaires.
Of multi-millionaires and billionaires.
If you are a billionaire or in the top 1%,
we will be an administration for the working families of this country and not for billionaire campaign contributors.
Okay, that's a pretty good ad.
The overall system that he is presenting.
And the next question comes from Fuad Mahmood. Thoughts on corporatism and distributism as an economic and social system. Once again, who this was intended for is not specified, but judging from the subject matter, I don't think it's a far cry to say that Paul is the intended recipient.
Yeah. Well, I can't say I'm against these things. I just don't think they're very relevant to our own experience. I always give these historicist responses. I'm not going to get up here, and attack distributist or attack, Catholic neo-corporatism or fascism. They just don't have much. By the way, corporatism didn't have much relevance even in fascist Italy, as I show in my book on fascism. It was mere window dressing. So, we're simply discussing here non-practical alternatives to what already exists, which is a form of state capitalism in most of the Western democracies today, in which there is also, some market economy that continues and parts of the economy that are not totally controlled by the state, or, I think that has become the dominant. It's a mixed economy because we have lots of social programs, and we're getting a lot more soon, and the government controls much of our earnings through the social programs and through its redistributionism. But this is neither corporatism nor is it what the person asking the question calls distributism.
And the next question is from Marius Erskov. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Okay, I wonder what's going on with Antifa in Portland.
Hey, stay the fuck back, fuckers. Fuck off.
Yes, sir.
You running over there, we're not going to come out and save you, so you got to come up with a...
I see it on that side of the street. I didn't even cross.
You got to come up with a different plan, like maybe go somewhere else.
All right.
We're not going to run out here and save you.
No, I wasn't, but I came to you guys. I didn't even know there was anybody out here. But I just stood there. They come out with pepper spray.
I'm just telling you that ain't going to happen again, so you got to go probably find something else, okay?
Okay.
We're not going to be home base for you.
I'm going to leave.
Okay, so Portland police have no interest in helping photographers who are attacked by Antifa. We're not going to be helpers for you. We're not going to rescue. It's the Portland police. Antifa are the shock troops of the establishment. Back to Nathan Coffness. The adult black-white IQ gap has remained stubbornly constant at approximately one standard deviation, 15 IQ points, among cohorts born since around 1970. Dickens and Flynn, 2006, reported that blacks gained 4 to 7 IQ points on non-Hispanic whites between 1972 and 2002, but these gains appear to be among blacks born before the early 70s. Indicate in 2002 the black-white IQ gap among 20-year-olds was approximately one standard deviation or 15 points. More recent evidence indicates that the gap has persisted or even widened. Intensive interventions can raise IQ substantially during childhood when the heritability of IQ is low, but despite some misleading claims about the success of early intervention programs, gains tend to dissolve by late adolescence or early childhood. Adoption by white families, one of the most extreme interventions possible, has virtually no effect on the IQ of black adoptees by adulthood. Black children adopted by middle and upper middle class white families in Minnesota obtained IQ scores at age 17 that were roughly identical to the African American average. Adoptees with one black biological parent obtained IQ scores that were intermediate between the black and white means. To reiterate, the high within-group heritability of IQ combined with the failure to find an environmental X factor to explain the IQ gap does not show decisively that race differences are genetic, because it is possible that an X factor will be discovered in the future. However, the environmentalist theory of race differences has not, by normal scientific standards, been an especially progressive research program. Environmentalists never predicted that the black-white IQ gap would, reaching one standard deviation, remain impervious to early education, adoption, massive improvements in the socioeconomic status of blacks, and the apparent waning of overt racism and discrimination. Commenting 45 years ago on environmentalist theories that appeal to an X factor, Urbach, 1974, noted that any data in the world can be made consistent with any theory by invoking nameless and untested factors. Nevertheless, we cannot technically say that the environmentalist explanation for the IQ gap has been falsified. That the gap did narrow since the early 20th century gives some credibility to the idea that environment is playing a role.
What is Paul's perspective on the dramatic anti-immigration turn taken by the Danish Social Democrats, and could a similar thing happen in the rest of Western Europe?
I'd like to think so, but I don't think. But it's not going to happen in Germany, where what's described as the party of the future are Die Grünen, the Greens, who want totally open borders, hate their country, say they don't want to be called Germans anymore. They want other people to come in and replace their population, and yet this party gets enormous numbers of votes. It's not going to happen in France because the only party that takes a strong stand against immigration which is the Rassemblement National. It's never going to go above 30 to 33, maybe 1/3 of the vote in the country, and that's in a presidential election. So I don't see where this is going to come. Italy, there may be a chance. Spain, no. You have a right-wing Vox party, but the party that's now in power just wants, let all the Muslims come into Spain. So I think what's happening with the Danish Social Democrats, which, by the way, is not anything new. This goes all the way back to the 1990s when I wrote my book After Liberalism. Danish Social Democrats have generally been conservative, if on nothing else, on immigration questions.
Looking at a tweet here by Sean Last, economic development correlates with an erosion of traditional values. Measurements of development and religion predict the majority of national variance in such values.
This is a continuation of positions that Danish socialists have been taking for the last 25 years.
And the next question comes from Teddy Man, and it's for both of us. And I think it's best described as a question with two sectors. So, hi, Joseph and Paul. Do you see an argument for American culture, identity, and history existing before 1776? Examples: Thanksgiving, Jamestown. Also, do you recognize a Catholic impression on America before 1776, such as Christopher Columbus and...
Okay, let's get something here from JF P. Meritocracy, monarchy versus democracy.
When there were elites in charge of our world, we were probably better served than by our own vote. The fact is, when you give the power of vote to a population, you put it in their hands to be doing the things that they need to do to protect themselves. And most of the population may not have evolved for this. When we had an aristocratic elite, it was bound to us in some very deep way. They had to do something that would lead... They may not have had interest in protecting our rights and everything, but they had an interest in us continuing existing. In the current world, they don't. In the current world, everything is determined by voting, and the population itself may not have been naturally selected to make rational decisions during voting.
Okay, back to...
And Amerigo Vespucci. I'll share my views first. Yes, I do think that there is a strong American identity existing before 1776. Without that, there'd be no America today. I'm from Florida. Florida being loyal to Great Britain during the American Revolution. I oppose the American Revolution. I'll explain that I don't think you could say it has much control in any way, shape, or form over these folks. So that is my answer to this. Paul, what's yours?
I think even before the founding of the United States as a constitutional republic, there was very definitely Catholic settlements in places like Maryland. Maryland was a predominantly Catholic colony and then state. There were later Catholic settlements in Louisiana, some in South Carolina, but the country was predominantly Northern European Protestant. The French who came here were predominantly Protestant French, although there were the Acadians in Louisiana. But then you had the Huguenots everywhere else. Where I live, there are people with French names. They have always been Protestants, probably since the 16th or 17th century. Their family. So, I think the Catholic influence was somewhat limited in the United States. But my problem is sort of like simply talking about a continuing culture over a long period of time. You go to I suppose the average Italian immigrant to the United States who went to an Italian parish church. I grew up in Connecticut. If you said, what do you think about Lord Calvert, who settled in Maryland? Or what about the Carroll family that signed the Declaration? They would have no way of relating to them. Simply the fact that, that these people are Catholic and they go to a Catholic parish would not have created any kind of bond. I used to be amused when, American Jews, mostly from Eastern Europe, were told, you really should like the American South because the Secretary of State of the Confederacy was Judah Benjamin. And you see, he came from a Sephardic Jewish family that settled in Charleston. He was married to actually a French Catholic wife and lived for a long time with Jefferson Davis's family. These people have no way of relating to Benjamin. You might as well talk about St. Paul or something. They have no way of relating to this. So it is not that we're looking at a continuing culture. We're looking at layers of settlement with different groups that have different perceptions of what it means to be American and different perceptions of the American past. I must, however, say, in favor of the Italians of New York City, I wrote an article on this, that they threatened, or at least, the mafia or somebody threatened to break the hands of anyone who pulls down the statue of Christopher Columbus. God bless those mafia members who said that. Because they have a hell of a lot more guts than the Southern whites who just sit by while their ancestors' graves are being desecrated and their Confederate statues are being pulled down. I mean, the Italians have guts, and they will fight for those for Columbus, even though Columbus sailed under a Spanish flag and was probably of Sephardic Jewish descent. But they will still fight for that man, And he was born in Genoa, and most of these people are from Sicily, but it doesn't make any difference. So, it's entirely to their credit that they're defending those statues against these crazy leftist intellectuals who want to pull them down.
Okay, Paul Gottfried there. All right, I think that will do it for today. Bye-bye.